Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to step back to the roaring streets of Brooklyn in the 1920s, where smoke curled from speakeasies and loyalty was measured in bullets and bourbon. This is the story of Frankie Yale, the polished gangster who turned Coney Island into his empire, the man who taught Al Capone everything he knew about power, money, and silence. But in the world of organized crime, every mentor eventually faces his own student, and Yale's story ends the way all legends do, in gunfire and betrayal. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? We love seeing this little underworld grow across cities, countries, and time zones. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us every night as we peel back the velvet curtain of the American Mafia. Now, pour yourself a drink, let the lights go low, and disappear into the rise and fall of Frankie Yale, mentor and victim of Al Capone. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, The Brooklyn Boy. Gunfire echoed down a Brooklyn street, and a man who once seemed untouchable slumped over his steering wheel, his lifeless eyes staring through the spidered glass of his brand-new Lincoln. The sound faded into the city's heartbeat, a rhythm of sirens, whispers, and disbelief. His name was Frankie Yale. To the underworld, he was both a gentleman and a killer, a contradiction stitched together by loyalty and ambition. But before he was the man gunned down in a storm of bullets, before his empire rose and collapsed in a swirl of blood and smoke, he was just a boy named Francesco Yule, born into the chaos of immigrant dreams. Long Island City, New York, 1902. The streets smelled of coal smoke, salt water, and survival. Francesco's parents, Neapolitan immigrants, had crossed the Atlantic chasing a promise that always seemed to fade as soon as they got close enough to touch it. They came with empty pockets but heavy hearts, believing that America was a place where hard work could buy respect. What they found instead was a world where men like them, dark-haired, thick-accented, and foreign, were treated like shadows. The docks of Brooklyn were their only refuge, and that's where Frankie grew up, where he learned that muscle often mattered more than morality. He was a small boy with sharp eyes, the kind that never blinked too long. The docks were his playground and his classroom. He watched men unload crates under the watch of corrupt dock bosses who paid off the police with folded bills hidden inside handshakes. He saw laborers beaten for asking questions, and gamblers stabbed for debts smaller than a loaf of bread. Somewhere between the smell of tar and the echo of seagulls, Frankie learned his first American lesson. Justice was for the rich, survival was for the clever. By 12, he was already running errands for local hustlers. Small stuff, carrying messages, delivering envelopes, sometimes collecting insurance from shopkeepers who knew better than to refuse. To outsiders, it looked like crime. To people like Frankie, it was tradition, the neighborhood's way of keeping order when the law didn't care. Italians called it rispetto, respect. It meant protecting your own, even when the world wouldn't. Every block had its own crew of boys trying to make a name for themselves. Fist fights were currency, and reputation was everything. Frankie wasn't the biggest, but he was fearless, and more importantly, he thought before he struck. He'd wait, let his enemies burn themselves out with rage, and then deliver one clean hit that ended the fight. It earned him something rare on those streets, quiet authority. At home, his mother prayed for him every night. She wanted her boy to grow up decent, maybe own a shop one day, maybe marry a girl from Naples and live a simple life. But Frankie's father, tired, beaten down by long hours on the docks, understood the truth his wife refused to see. In their world, decency didn't feed the family. The men who had money wore suits, not sweat. They didn't beg for raises. They made people fear saying no. When Frankie came home one evening with a pocket full of cash and no explanation, his father said nothing. He only nodded once, a small, silent approval that said, "Now you understand how this country works." By the time Frankie was 15, The city had swallowed his innocence whole. He'd seen men killed for gambling debts, watched the police take bribes like it was part of their uniform, and realized that power didn't come from good intentions. It came from control. Control of fear, control of people, control of money. And Frankie wanted all of it. The Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn were tight-knit, built on old-world codes that the Americans couldn't comprehend. Loyalty to family came first, loyalty to friends second, and loyalty to the law came somewhere after survival. Frankie absorbed it all. He wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He simply understood that violence was a language everyone respected, and he spoke it fluently. On summer nights, when the streets buzzed with the sound of jazz spilling out from saloons, Frankie would stand outside the bars, studying the men in their sharp suits, the ones who drove new cars and never seemed to work. He knew who they were: gangsters, bootleggers, fixers. They had what he wanted: influence. They didn't bow to anyone. To a boy like him, that wasn't crime. It was liberation. But every rise begins with temptation. One evening, as he was hanging near the pier, a man named Angelo Caruso, one of the local racketeers, tossed him a coin and told him to keep watch while they collected dues from a stubborn grocer. The man's screams echoed out to the street. Frankie didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes on the corner, watching for cops. That was his first job. The next day, Caruso handed him a few bills and a grin. "You did good, kid," he said. That's all it took. Frankie wasn't just surviving anymore. He was stepping into a system that rewarded loyalty, punished weakness, and promised something the honest world never did: respect. As Prohibition neared, whispers of opportunity rolled through the alleys like smoke. The city's underworld was shifting, preparing for a new kind of war. One fought not with fists but with liquor. Men like Caruso started making serious money. Frankie watched, learned, and waited. He was smart enough to know that patience was power. The kind of man who waited for his chance instead of forcing it. But patience couldn't hide ambition forever. He began organizing small-time card games, lending money on the side, even stepping in to mediate disputes between rival kids from different blocks. People started to look up to him, not because he was ruthless, but because he was reliable. Frankie had that rare quality that made men trust him and fear him at the same time. He'd laugh with you, share a drink with you, but if you crossed him, you'd regret it before dawn. By 18, Frankie was already dressing like a made man. Slick suits, shiny shoes, and that calm, unbothered expression that never revealed what he was thinking. They called him Yale, a name he chose himself. It sounded classy, respectable, a little American. It was the final step in burying Francesco Yule, the poor immigrant kid from the docks. Frankie Yale was a new invention, a man who could sit with gangsters or businessmen and blend in perfectly with both. He began running with tougher circles, men connected to the Black Hand, the early extortion gangs that preyed on immigrants too afraid to go to the police. They'd send threatening letters marked with a crude black handprint, demanding money in exchange for safety. Frankie didn't write those letters, but he made sure the people who received them paid up. And if they didn't, he made sure they wouldn't make that mistake twice. It wasn't personal. That was the strange morality of his world. Violence wasn't about hate. It was about order. You had to make examples. You had to keep the streets balanced. Not peaceful, but predictable. Frankie understood this instinctively. He'd tell the younger boys, never get emotional. Emotion gets you sloppy. Sloppy gets you dead. Still, there were nights when the old life tugged at him, when he'd walk past his mother's house and smell her cooking, or hear her singing softly through the window. For a moment, he'd feel like a boy again, the one who believed in simpler dreams. But then a car would drive by, full of laughing men in tailored suits, and that feeling would vanish. The world was changing, and Frankie wasn't about to be left behind. When World War I ended, returning soldiers flooded the streets looking for work that didn't exist. Poverty deepened, desperation grew, and crime became the city's unofficial economy. Frankie saw the future coming before most. He started setting up bars that never closed, hiring his own men, and paying off the right cops. The locals respected him because he kept the neighborhood clean. No petty theft, no outside gangs. Only business. He had one rule: loyalty above all. Anyone who broke that rule disappeared, quietly. Rumor had it that he'd personally handled a man who tried to cheat him out of a shipment of whiskey. The story went that Yale didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply smiled, offered the man a drink, and then walked him outside. The next morning, the man's body was found floating near the docks. The message was clear. Frankie Yale had arrived. He wasn't the loudest or the most violent, but he was precise. Every move was calculated. Every ally was chosen. The streets called him the gentleman gangster because he wore his suits like armor and spoke with the calm authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. But beneath that polish was still the boy from Brooklyn, the kid who had watched his father bow to dock bosses and sworn he never would. He'd built himself from nothing, and yet, deep down, he carried a quiet fear that it could all vanish as quickly as it came. That's the paradox of power. Once you have it, you live in constant fear of losing it. One evening, as he stood outside his bar watching the lights of Coney Island flicker across the water, he saw a group of rowdy teenagers causing trouble near the entrance. One of them was a stocky kid with slicked hair and a crooked grin. When Yale stepped out, the group scattered, all except the kid. He stood his ground, eyes burning with the same defiance Frankie once had. The two locked eyes for a long moment, and Yale felt something strange: recognition. It was like looking at a reflection of his younger self, wild and hungry. He didn't know it yet, but that boy would change his life forever. The kid's name was Alphonse Capone. That night, as the last patrons stumbled home and the lights dimmed, Frankie Yale leaned against his bar and smiled faintly. He didn't know why. Maybe instinct, maybe fate. But something told him that the boy from Brooklyn who refused to flinch would one day walk a darker path than even he had dared to imagine. The city outside was restless, whispering with the promise of a new age. Prohibition was on the horizon, and men like Frankie Yale were about to become kings. But kings never keep their thrones forever. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the night, destiny was already loading its gun. The streets of Brooklyn were changing, and so was the boy who had learned to rule them. Chapter 2. From Frankie Yale to Frankie Yale. The year was 1917, and Brooklyn was pulsing with a new rhythm, the rhythm of ambition, jazz, and liquor. The Great War had ended overseas, and while the rest of America tried to return to normal, the streets of New York had no intention of slowing down. Beneath the noise of streetcars and laughter, something was stirring in the shadows. The city's underworld was transforming, and at its center stood a man who had learned how to turn survival into strategy. Frankie Yale, the tough kid from Long Island City, was ready to reinvent himself. And like all men chasing power, he knew the first step was to erase the past. Names had power in those days. The right one could open doors, and the wrong one could get you killed. Francesco Yule was a name that spoke of immigrants, dock workers, and sweat. But Frankie Yale, that sounded like class, like respectability, like someone you couldn't ignore. He chose it deliberately, not from arrogance, but calculation. Yale had prestige. It was an American name, clean and sharp. In a city where Italians were still treated as outsiders, Yale sounded like he belonged. It was a camouflage of syllables, designed to blend a street hustler into the world of gentlemen. By the time the new name caught on, Frankie was already building his legend. He'd saved enough to open his own bar, a speakeasy on Coney Island called the Harvard Inn. The name was ironic, almost poetic. A place named after university, owned by a man who barely went to school. But Frankie understood branding before the word even existed. The Harvard Inn wasn't just a bar, it was an image. An image in the criminal world was everything. The inn was small, smoky, and always full. Jazz bands played in the corner, couples danced on sticky floors, and men in suits slipped into back rooms for business that couldn't survive daylight. Frankie was everywhere, shaking hands, pouring drinks, cracking jokes. To the drunks and the dreamers, he was a charming host. To the cops, he was a generous businessman. To his men, he was something closer to a general. The Harvard Inn wasn't just entertainment. It was a command post, disguised in neon and whiskey. It was there that fate walked in one night wearing a cheap suit and a cocky grin. A young kid looking for work, barely out his teens, muscles under his shirt and a dangerous kind of confidence in his eyes. Frankie looked him over, saw the scars, the attitude, the hunger. He liked him immediately. The kid said his name was Al Capone. Yale didn't know it then, but that meeting would change the course of American crime forever. He gave Capone a job as a bouncer, part muscle, part watchman, part enforcer. The kid took to it fast, maybe too fast. He had a way of handling trouble that mixed charm with violence, a perfect cocktail for a place like the Harvard Inn. And when Capone got into a fight one night, defending the bar's reputation, he left with a permanent souvenir, 3 long scars across his cheek, a mark that would follow him all the way to Chicago. Frankie patched him up himself, then clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll be fine, kid," he said. "Chicks dig scars." It was half joke, half blessing. The Harvard Inn thrived. Soldiers returning from the war brought stories, trauma, and an unending thirst for alcohol. Frankie supplied it all, legally and otherwise. Even before Prohibition, he was laying the groundwork, connections with smugglers, bartenders, corrupt officers. He understood something others didn't. Crime wasn't about chaos. It was about consistency. He made sure every delivery was on time, every debt was collected, and every man who worked for him was treated with a mix of fear and fairness that made loyalty easy. But with power came enemies. The streets around Coney Island were a patchwork of small gangs, each claiming a few blocks. Disputes were constant. Frankie didn't always fight back with guns. He preferred leverage. If someone caused trouble, he'd send them a message, often without saying a word. Maybe their car got torched. Maybe their supplier disappeared. Maybe their favorite girl suddenly stopped showing up at the bar. Frankie's silence spoke louder than most men's threats. That's what made him dangerous. His reputation spread fast. The gentleman gangster, the man who never raised his voice, but always got what he wanted. To some, he was an inspiration. To others, a ghost to be feared. And yet, in private, he remained strangely calm. He loved good food, clean suits, and quiet nights listening to the city hum. He never saw himself as a criminal. In his mind, he was a businessman playing by the only rules that made sense in a broken system. Meanwhile, the young Capone watched, listened, and learned. He studied Yale's every move, how he spoke to cops, how he handled disputes, how he turned violence into theater. Frankie was the mentor Al didn't know he needed. And Yale, in return, saw something in the kid that reminded him of himself years earlier. Raw ambition wrapped in street smarts. The two became close. Frankie would often take Capone for late-night drives through Brooklyn, showing him the neighborhoods, pointing out which corners belonged to which men, explaining how respect was more powerful than fear, and how real control came from making people think they owed you. "A good boss," he told him once, "doesn't make men afraid. He makes them grateful." Capone never forgot that. But Brooklyn was changing faster than anyone could keep up. By 1920, America passed the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. Alcohol was outlawed overnight, and a billion-dollar black market was born. To most Americans, it was chaos. To Frankie Yale, it was opportunity on a silver platter. He had the bars, the connections, and the men to make it work. He began importing liquor from Canada, smuggling it through the docks with help from the same corrupt officials who had once arrested him. Money flowed like the whiskey he sold. Within a year, Yale went from a local bar owner to a bootlegging king. His trucks ran up and down the East Coast, disguised as bakery deliveries and produce shipments. Police officers on his payroll looked the other way. Rival gangs tried to cut in, but Frankie's men handled them efficiently. There were shootings, sure, but they were quiet, professional like surgical strikes. Yale didn't believe in public spectacles. He believed in disappearing problems. Despite his growing empire, Yale kept the same calm demeanor that made him unique. He wasn't a flashy showman like Capone would later become. He dressed sharp, spoke soft, and preferred a handshake to a headline. Yet behind that smooth exterior was a man who could order a killing with the same tone he used to order lunch. People admired him because he was disciplined, a rare thing in a world run by emotion. Still, not everyone respected the new order. The old Black Hand gangs resented how Yale modernized the business. They thrived on fear, kidnappings, and chaos. Frankie wanted efficiency, structure, hierarchy. He envisioned something closer to an organization than a street gang, what would one day become the model for the American Mafia. In many ways, he was building the foundation that men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello would later perfect. But with each success came risk. The more power Yale gained, the more enemies he attracted. Rival crews began targeting his trucks. Informants whispered to the police, and the streets grew bloodier by the month. Frankie responded not with panic, but precision. He expanded his network, hiring better drivers, more loyal enforcers, even buying legitimate businesses to launder his growing fortune. The line between crime and commerce blurred until even he couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. The Harvard became a symbol, a mix of glamour and danger. Politicians visited discreetly. Movie stars came to drink what they couldn't legally buy elsewhere. And somewhere in that haze of smoke and jazz, Yale became larger than life, a name spoken in both admiration and fear. But success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds exposure. The police couldn't ignore him forever. He was arrested a few times, assault, bootlegging, racketeering. But nothing stuck. Witnesses forgot what they saw. Evidence vanished. Juries were mysteriously sympathetic. Each time he walked free, his legend grew. To the public, he was untouchable. To his enemies, he was a storm that could strike at any moment. At home, he tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He married, had children, bought a house. Neighbors saw him as a generous man who donated to local parishes and handed out turkeys at Christmas. They didn't see the late-night meetings, the coded phone calls, the whispered orders that decided who lived and who didn't. Frankie balanced both worlds, the family man and the crime boss, with the poise of a man who knew exactly what he stood to lose. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, cracks began to form. Prohibition made fortunes, but it also made monsters. Violence escalated. Loyalty became currency. And in a business built on betrayal, trust was a luxury no one could afford. Frankie had built his empire on loyalty, but loyalty had a price. The men who swore allegiance today could turn tomorrow if someone offered more money or less fear. One night, as rain slicked the streets of Brooklyn, Frankie stood alone outside the Harvard Inn. The city glowed in reflections, red neon bleeding into puddles. He took a drag from his cigarette and stared into the distance. He could feel it, the world shifting again. Prohibition had made kings out of killers, and he knew kings didn't last. Somewhere deep down, he sensed that his own story was moving towards something inevitable. Inside the bar, Al Capone laughed with a group of soldiers on leave, telling stories, flashing that dangerous smile that could disarm or destroy. Frankie watched him quietly, studying the young man who had become both student and shadow. Capone had grown bolder, louder, hungrier. There was a spark in him, the kind that could either light up a room or burn it down. Frankie admired it, but he also feared it. The boy he'd once hired as a bouncer was turning into something else, something bigger, something unstoppable. As the night went on, a fight broke out near the back tables. Capone moved fast, dragging one man out by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Frankie stepped in, calm as ever, his voice soft but final. "Enough," he said. And just like that, the chaos stopped. But in that moment, as their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the world wasn't big enough for two men like them. Weeks later, Yale received a letter from Chicago. Johnny Torrio, one of the biggest bootleggers in the country, wanted Capone, said he could use a man like him out west. Frankie hesitated. Losing Capone meant losing his protege, his mirror, his future. But he knew better than to hold back ambition. "Go," he told him finally. "There's more money in Chicago than Brooklyn will ever see." And so, Al Capone left, carrying with him everything Frankie had taught him. Patience, charm, control. Yale watched him go, not realizing he was sending away the one man who would later decide his fate. Brooklyn carried on. The Harvard stayed busy. The trucks kept running. The cash kept flowing. Frankie Yale's name echoed through the alleys and parlors, whispered with both respect and dread. Yet the nights grew colder, the tension thicker. Prohibition had made millionaires overnight, but it had also written the first pages of a tragedy that would claim them one by one. Standing at his bar one evening, watching the lights flicker against the glass bottles, Frankie felt that same unease again, a strange chill in the air that even the warmth of whiskey couldn't chase away. He didn't know it yet, but history had already drawn the line between mentor and victim. In the distance, across the steel and smoke of America, Chicago was calling, and with it, the echo of a student who would one day return, not as a friend, but as fate. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Black Hand. The city was changing, but one thing in Brooklyn never did: fear. It was the kind that lived in alleyways and whispered through back doors, carried in letters smeared with ink and dread. Before organized crime became a business, before the Mafia became a brand, there was something older, cruder, and far more terrifying: the Black Hand. It wasn't an organization so much as an idea, a loose network of extortionists who used terror the way others used logic. And for a young gangster like Frankie Yale, it was both a threat and a lesson in power. In the years before Prohibition, Italian immigrants had built their own shadow world inside New York. It was a world where the police couldn't be trusted, where language barriers and prejudice made justice impossible. So when the Black Hand appeared, men who promised protection from harm, for a price, many families paid without question. Those who didn't often woke to find their shops burned, their livestock slaughtered, or worse, their children gone. It was medieval in its cruelty, but it worked. Fear was currency, and the Black Hand printed it daily. Frankie had seen their letters. He remembered the look in a shopkeeper's eyes when he unfolded a note scrawled in broken Italian, demanding money and signed with a crude drawing of a black hand. It was simple, effective, and unstoppable. The police laughed it off as immigrant superstition, but Frankie knew better. He'd seen the aftermath. A man who refused to pay might vanish overnight, his body found days later floating near the docks, throat slit, the mark of the Black Hand carved into his chest. It was theater designed to terrify, and Frankie studied it the way an artist studies composition. The brutality wasn't random. It was deliberate. Every act meant to send a message that outlasted the scream. But Frankie wasn't the kind of man who paid tribute forever. He saw the Black Hand not as something to fear, but as a model to perfect. They ruled by chaos, and chaos left money on the table. Frankie wanted order. He wanted a system that ran like a business, not a circus of violence. And as he watched them work, he realized their greatest weakness: lack of control. Anyone could claim the Black Hand's name, extort a few dollars, and vanish. There was no structure, no accountability. Frankie wanted to build something stronger, something permanent. His first step came quietly. He began to mediate disputes between merchants and extortionists, offering to negotiate payments in exchange for peace. It was a clever trick. He played both savior and sinner. Within months, people began coming to him first, not the police, when they received a Black Hand letter. Frankie would take care of it. Sometimes he'd pay off the extortionists. Other times, he'd have them disappear. Slowly, control shifted from the faceless terror of the Black Hand to the calm, reliable presence of Yale. Fear still ruled, but now it had a face, and that face wore a tailored suit. By 1921, the Black Hand's power in Brooklyn had begun to fade, swallowed by more organized crews who realized there was more money in collaboration than chaos. Frankie stood at the crossroads of that transformation. His operations grew cleaner, more efficient. He paid attention to detail: how his men dressed, how they spoke, even how they handled violence. He taught them restraint. "We're not animals," he'd tell them. "We're businessmen who use different tools." That philosophy was what separated him from the old guard. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building an empire brick by brick, handshake by handshake. Still, remnants of the old world lingered. There were men who refused to accept this new order, brutes and hotheads who missed the simplicity of blood for blood. They saw Yale's discipline as weakness. He dealt with them the same way he handled everything else, with patience and precision. If a man stepped out of line, Frankie wouldn't yell. He'd simply nod to one of his lieutenants, and by morning the problem would be solved. His quiet methods became legend. People whispered that Yale could make a man vanish without leaving a ripple. That kind of myth was worth more than any bullet. The shift from Black Hand terror to organized power didn't happen overnight, but Frankie was at the center of it. He formed alliances with other Brooklyn bosses, men like Joe Masuria, who understood that unity was the future. Together, they divided territories, standardized protection fees, and established rules. It was the birth of something that would later be called the Mafia, though at the time, it was simply business done right. Frankie also understood something that most gangsters didn't. Appearance mattered. He didn't want his operations to look like criminal enterprises. He wanted legitimacy. So he invested in front businesses, laundries, trucking companies, restaurants. The Harvard Inn was just the beginning. He opened a funeral parlor, a perfect front for laundering money and moving goods discreetly. Death was one of the few industries that thrived in every season, and Frankie made sure it thrived for him too. Some said he even used his own funeral cars to transport liquor during Prohibition. A grim irony, but effective. Meanwhile, the younger generation of gangsters, many of whom had once idolized the Black Hand's ruthlessness, began to see Yale as the model of the new era. He was polished, organized, and most importantly, he made money. That was the new religion. Money replaced fear as the ultimate weapon. Frankie knew that better than anyone. He could buy police protection, silence witnesses, and bribe judges. In the old world, a gun made men obey. In the new one, cash did. But success always draws shadows. The remnants of the Black Hand didn't vanish quietly. They saw Yale's rise as betrayal, a young upstart daring to erase their legacy. Some plotted revenge, sending anonymous letters to his businesses, demanding payment or threatening his family. Frankie laughed them off at first, but when one of his drivers was found shot in an alley with the mark of the Black Hand carved into his chest, he knew it wasn't idle talk. For the first time in years, Frankie felt the ghost of fear, not for himself, but for what it meant. Someone was challenging his authority, reopening wounds he'd already closed. He responded not with panic, but strategy. He called in his most trusted men, poured them drinks, and said simply, "No more letters." The message was clear. End it. Over the next month, the bodies of known Black Hand operatives began to turn up across Brooklyn. No fanfare, no public spectacle, just quiet disappearances, one after another, until the letters stopped. Frankie never spoke of it again. The silence itself was victory. What followed was a golden stretch for Yale. His funeral home business gave him legitimacy, his speakeasies gave him power, and his reputation gave him protection. He wasn't just another gangster anymore. He was an institution. When people in Brooklyn whispered his name, it wasn't in fear, it was in reverence. He was the man who made chaos orderly, who turned extortion into enterprise. Yet for all his power, Frankie never forgot where he came from. He still walked the streets of his neighborhood, tipping his hat to shopkeepers, donating to churches, and handing out cash to struggling families. He understood that fear alone wasn't enough. You had to buy love, too. It made him untouchable. Cops saw him as a benefactor, locals as a hero, and criminals as a king. But kings breed envy. Across the East River, other bosses were rising. Men like Joe the Boss, Masuria, Salvatore D'Aquila, and a young upstart named Lucky Luciano. The city was heading toward a new kind of war, one that would make the Black Hand's chaos look quaint. Frankie's calm demeanor masked a growing sense of unease. He had built a kingdom of balance, but balance never lasts forever in the underworld. Power doesn't stay still, it shifts violently. One night, Frankie sat in his office above the Harvard Inn, looking over his accounts while the sound of laughter and jazz drifted up from below. A knock came at the door. It was one of his lieutenants, face pale, eyes nervous. "Boss," he said quietly, "there's talk. Daquila's men are saying they're going to test Brooklyn. They say you've gotten too big." Frankie didn't look up. He simply closed the ledger and said, "Then we'll remind them whose city this is." That was the moment the Black Hand era officially died. The last of the old-school extortionists were swallowed by the new age of organized crime, a machine with rules, ranks, and rituals. And Frankie Yale was its architect. The world of random violence was gone, replaced by the quiet efficiency of power that moved through backrooms, not alleys. Still, in the darkest corners of Brooklyn, old ghosts whispered. There are those who still remembered the letters, the symbols, the fear. And while Frankie had buried the Black Hand, its spirit lingered in his own empire. The same use of intimidation, the same mastery of silence. The difference was that now, the fear had a system. By the early 1920s, Frankie's influence stretched beyond Brooklyn. His trucks ran up to New England, his liquor flowed into speakeasies across the state, and his connections reached Chicago, where a familiar name had begun making headlines. Al Capone. The kid he'd once hired to throw out drunks had become a national story, the face of bootlegging in the Midwest. Frankie read about him in the papers, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He felt pride, maybe even a little envy. Capone had taken everything Yale had taught him and turned it into empire. But Frankie didn't see him as competition, not yet. He saw him as proof that his way worked. At night, when the city grew quiet and the sea wind carried the faint smell of salt and liquor, Frankie sometimes thought back to those early days. The fear, the letters, the men who ruled with knives and shadows. He had survived them all, replaced them all, and outlived them all. But deep down, he understood something he could never admit out loud. The Black Hand never really disappeared. It had just evolved. It lived on in him, in every threat he made, in every silent nod that sealed a man's fate. The monster he had once feared was now the reflection he saw in the mirror. And so, as the lights of Coney Island flickered against the horizon, Frankie Yale stood at the edge of his own creation, a world built on discipline, fear, and profit. He had buried the old ways, forged new ones, and in the process, become something both greater and more dangerous than any man before him. But power is a funny thing. It feeds on itself, demanding more. The same fear that once protected him would soon become the very thing that surrounded him. Because in the underworld, ghosts don't stay buried forever. They wait, patient and unseen, for the moment when the king looks away. And in the shadows of Brooklyn, the streets were already whispering the next chapter of his fate. Chapter 4. Opening the Harvard Inn. The sea wind rolled over Coney Island that summer like a sigh, carrying the scent of salt, beer, and cigarette smoke through the maze of lights and laughter. It was 1917, and New York was still celebrating the end of the Great War, still dancing, still pretending the world hadn't changed. But in a small corner of Brooklyn, a new kind of empire was quietly being born. It didn't wear crowns or wave flags. It served drinks behind polished wood and whispered deals over music that drowned out secrets. The place was called the Harvard Inn, and behind its bar stood a man who understood better than anyone that power didn't always come from bullets. Sometimes it came from a smile and a well-poured glass. Frankie Yale was no longer the boy from the docks. He was becoming something else entirely. The decision to open the Harvard Inn wasn't impulsive. Frankie had been watching, calculating. He saw what others missed. The hunger in returning soldiers, the boredom in the working men, the loneliness in their eyes when they came home to cramped apartments and empty pockets. People wanted escape. They wanted noise, laughter, music. They wanted to feel alive. Frankie would give it to them, for a price. The inn started as a gamble, funded by a mix of savings, favors, and debts. But Frankie didn't open it to make money. He opened it to make a statement. The Harvard Inn wasn't just a bar. It was his stage, his headquarters, his declaration that he had arrived. The building itself was nothing special from the outside. A narrow brick front on Seaside Walk, squeezed between a bakery and a tailor's shop. But inside, It was pure electricity. The air buzzed with cigarette smoke and the hum of jazz. A pianist played tunes from the war, and the clinking of glasses made a rhythm all its own. Men in flat caps and women in sequin dresses crowded the floor. Waiters in crisp white shirts darted between tables. And in the center of it all, always watching, always listening, was Frankie Yale, suit immaculate, hair slicked, eyes sharp enough to cut through the noise. He greeted everyone personally, shaking hands with dockworkers and politicians alike. That was part of his magic. He treated everyone like they mattered, even when they didn't. He'd laugh with you, pour you a drink, and remember your name the next time you walked through the door. It was charm, but it was also control. People who felt seen were easier to own. It didn't take long for the Harvard Inn to become the most popular joint in Coney Island. The crowds poured in from every direction. Soldiers, hustlers, rich kids from Manhattan, slumming it for thrills. The laughter was loud, the music louder, and beneath it all was the sound of money being made. But not every customer was there for the booze. Some came for business. Frankie made sure of that. In the back room, behind a door disguised as a storage closet, real deals were struck. Whiskey shipments, protection payments, gambling stakes, all arranged with Yale's quiet precision. He never raised his voice, never threatened. He didn't have to. His reputation did the talking. Still, for all his polish, Frankie had not forgotten the lessons of the street. He knew how quickly fortune could shift. That's why he surrounded himself with men who owed him everything. Loyalty wasn't requested. It was built layer by layer. He paid his workers better than most. He protected them when the law didn't. And when they crossed him, he made sure their punishment was so silent, so final, that no one ever forgot who they betrayed. Fear and gratitude, the twin pillars of his empire. One summer night, a commotion broke out near the entrance. A group of drunken soldiers had been heckling a young waitress, shoving her around while the band tried to drown it out. Frankie stepped forward, his voice low but calm. "That's enough, boys. You've had your fun." The tallest soldier turned, sneering, eyes glassy with drink. "Who's going to stop me?" he slurred. Frankie didn't move. He just looked at one of his men, a big kid with slick hair and a boxer's stance, and gave a nod. In seconds, the soldier was on the floor, jaw broken, the room silent except for the crackle of the record player. That kid's name was Al Capone. He had been hanging around the inn for weeks, looking for work, bragging about fights and street jobs. Frankie had seen dozens like him before, loud, reckless, ambitious. But there was something different about this one. The kid had fire in his eyes, and not the kind that burned out fast. He was fearless, but not stupid. Frankie saw potential. After that night, he made him the inn's new bouncer. Capone threw himself into the job like it was destiny. He worked the door, broke up fights, and charmed the women who flocked to the bar. He also learned, quietly, carefully, by watching Yale. Frankie didn't teach with words. He taught by example. The way he handled customers, the way he paid off cops with a wink and a handshake, the way he turned threats into business opportunities. It was a masterclass in power. One night, after closing, the two sat at the bar, the room empty except for the faint smell of smoke and whiskey. Capone asked, "How'd you get here, boss?" "From nothing to this." Frankie poured him a drink, his expression unreadable. "Same way you will, kid," he said softly. "By making people believe you're bigger than you are, until you are." It was advice that would shape Capone's future. But for now, he was content to play his part. And under Frankie's wing, he flourished. The Harvard Inn became more than a bar. It became a school for gangsters. A place where the next generation of criminals learned that the real art of survival wasn't violence. It was presentation. Outside, the world was changing. Prohibition loomed on the horizon, and whispers of opportunity drifted through every back alley. Men like Yale were already preparing. Liquor would soon become gold, and whoever controlled it would control the city. Frankie began making quiet deals with suppliers in Canada, securing routes through the docks and trucks disguised as legitimate deliveries. He had eyes everywhere: longshoremen, warehouse clerks, even policemen on his payroll. The system was forming, one bribe at a time, but not everyone was happy about it. Old-school gangsters, the ones who still clung to the chaos of the Black Hand days, saw Frankie's growing influence as a threat. They called him arrogant, said he'd forgotten where he came from. Frankie ignored them. He knew better than to argue with men who wouldn't live long enough to matter. His empire grew quickly. The Harvard and became the beating heart of Brooklyn nightlife. Bootleggers, politicians, even detectives came to drink under its dim lights. Everyone wanted a piece of Yale's world, and Frankie made sure they got just enough to keep them hungry. He was everywhere, at weddings, funerals, street festivals, always dressed like a movie star, always smiling. People started to say he could walk into a room full of enemies and leave with allies. Maybe it was his charm. Maybe it was fear. Maybe both. Capone watched it all with wide eyes. He was young, brash, and impatient. Frankie was the opposite, deliberate, calm, a master of timing. They balanced each other perfectly. When Capone lost his temper, Frankie cooled him down. When Frankie hesitated, Capone pushed. They were mentor and student, but they were also foreshadowing two sides of the same coin. It was during those years that Yale began shaping the Brooklyn underworld into something resembling order. He formed pacts with rival crews, set fair prices for liquor, and even mediated disputes between bosses. Violence dropped. Profits soared. The newspapers barely mentioned his name, but on the streets, everyone knew who really ran the borough. And Frankie liked it that way. Fame brought attention, and attention brought death. He preferred power and silence. But power always leaks. One night, as Frankie left the inn, a bullet shattered the air beside him, grazing his arm. The shooter vanished into the dark before anyone could react. It was a warning, not an execution. The message was simple: stay in your lane. Frankie didn't flinch. He wrapped his wound in a handkerchief, lit a cigarette, and said to Capone, "They just told us we're winning." The next day, one of his lieutenants found a shooter in a boarding house. He didn't live long enough to explain who sent him. Frankie never asked. He didn't care. You didn't waste energy chasing ghosts when you were building a kingdom. Inside the Harvard Inn, life went on as if nothing had happened. The music played, the glasses clinked, and Frankie smiled like always. But his eyes were colder now. He understood that the more he rose, the smaller his circle had to become. Trust wasn't loyalty, it was leverage. And every man had a price. Still, there were moments when the facade slipped. Late at night, after everyone had gone, he'd sit alone at the bar, staring into a glass half full of bourbon, listening to the creak of the wooden floorboards. He wasn't sentimental. He didn't believe in nostalgia, but he couldn't shake the memory of the boy who used to watch gangsters from the sidewalk, dreaming of this life. He had everything he'd ever wanted: power, money, respect, and yet a strange emptiness lingered. Success, he realized, was like whiskey. It burned going down and left you thirsty for more. By 1919, Capone was getting restless. Chicago was calling, a city exploding with opportunity, run by Johnny Torrio, one of Yale's old business partners. Torrio needed men who could think and act, men with nerve and charm. Frankie saw the future in Capone's eyes. The kid was meant for something bigger. One night, he handed him an envelope of cash and said, "Go west, make your name. Just remember who showed you the ropes." Capone hesitated, then grinned. "I'll make you proud, boss." Frankie smirked. "Don't make me regret it." And just like that, the student left for Chicago, carrying Frankie's lessons in his blood: patience, power, and the art of control. For a moment, the Harvard Inn felt emptier. The nights were quieter, the laughter shorter. Frankie missed the kid, though he'd never admit it. But he knew this was how the game worked. You trained the next man to rise, and someday, he'd either return as an ally or as a rival. The business continued to grow. Prohibition officially hit in 1920, and the Harvard Inn transformed overnight. What had once been a bar became the front for a vast network of smuggling and distribution. Frankie's trucks ran liquor up and down the coast, his men guarding them like soldiers. Police raids came and went, But Yale always stayed one step ahead. He had friends in every department, judges who owed him favors, politicians who owed him silence. Money talked. It always did. Yet for all his control, Frankie couldn't control time. The city was changing again, faster, rougher, more ruthless. Younger men were coming up, men who didn't respect the old rules. They used Tommy guns instead of threats. They didn't negotiate. They annihilated. And while Frankie still ruled Brooklyn, he could feel the edges closing in. The game he had mastered was evolving, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he liked where it was heading. One late night, he stood in the doorway of the Harvard Inn, the neon sign flickering faintly above him. The streets were empty. The ocean murmured in the distance. He took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of salt and whiskey and memory. Behind him, the music played on, softer now, a fading echo of his youth. He wondered, just for a second, how long it would last. How long before someone else wanted what he had built? He didn't know it yet, but the answer was already on its way. Driving west through the night, carrying his legacy in a scarred face and a promise unspoken. The Harvard Inn had made him king of Brooklyn. But every kingdom, no matter how powerful, eventually meets its storm. And Frankie Yale's was coming, roaring on the wind from Chicago. Chapter 5. Mentoring Capone. The first time Frankie Yale really saw Al Capone, he wasn't looking at a kid. He was looking at a reflection of himself, years younger, rougher around the edges, but already burning with that unmistakable fire. Coney Island was alive that night, music spilling from the Harvard and like laughter from the devil's mouth. It was 1917, and the world outside was recovering from a war, but inside Frankie's bar, another kind of war was beginning. One fought not with rifles, but with loyalty, charm, and violence wrapped in silk. Capone was still green then, a young man with wide shoulders, quick fists, and no fear of anything, not even Frankie himself. That fearlessness caught Yale's eye immediately. It wasn't stupidity, it was hunger, the kind that got men killed or made them kings. Capone had been hanging around the inn for weeks, picking fights, flashing smiles, trying to get noticed. Frankie finally gave in one night after watching him knock out two troublemakers with one punch each. When the crowd cleared, Capone stood there breathing hard, blood on his knuckles and a grin stretching across his face. Frankie lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and said, "You fight good, kid, but you think too loud. You gotta learn to be quiet." That was how it started, not with a contract or a ceremony, but with a warning disguised as advice. Frankie put him to work at the door. It wasn't glamorous, keeping drunks in line, throwing out trouble, collecting the occasional protection payment, but Capone took to it like a soldier to battle. He was loyal, fast, and sharp. And Frankie noticed that beneath the swagger was something rare, discipline, the kind that could be molded. At night, after the bar closed, he'd pour the kid a drink, and the two of them would talk. Frankie didn't waste words, and Capone didn't ask questions. He just listened. He absorbed everything. How Yale managed the police, how he handled suppliers, how he kept peace between rival crews without ever pulling a trigger. Frankie's lessons weren't about crime. They were about control. You want to last in this life, he'd say. You don't let the world see what makes you angry. You keep your face still, even when someone's got a gun in yours. You act like you already won. Capone nodded every time, though Frankie knew it wasn't easy for him. The kid had a temper. You could see it flash behind his eyes, that raw heat waiting to explode. Frankie had it once too, back before he learned that rage is like whiskey. Too much of it makes you sloppy. He didn't want Capone to make the same mistakes. The two became inseparable in those early months. Yale would take Capone along when he met with politicians or rival gangsters, letting him watch the choreography of crime, the subtle glances, the coded language, the smiles that hid knives. He wanted the boy to understand that power wasn't about who had the most muscle. It was about who could make everyone else think they needed you. Fear makes people obey, he told them once, but respect makes them follow. Fear fades. Respect sticks. Capone was a quick learner. He started dressing better, speaking softer, even walking with the same quiet confidence Frankie had. The regulars at the Harvard and began to notice it too. The loudmouth bouncer was gone. In his place stood a young man who looked like he could own the place one day. And in a way, he did, at least the lessons that came with it. But every lesson in Yale's world came with blood. It wasn't long before Capone faced his first real test. A rival crew had been shaking down one of Yale's suppliers, demanding payment for protection. Frankie sent Capone and two others to deliver a message. Simple, quick, unmistakable. When they came back, their clothes were dirty, their faces pale. Capone was the only one smiling. Frankie didn't ask what happened. He just nodded. Good. Now you know what it feels like. He wasn't talking about killing. He was talking about power. That cold clarity that comes when you realize other men's lives can hang from your decisions. It was the moment every gangster either broke or became something new. Capone had crossed the line and didn't even flinch. The two of them grew close, not like father and son, but like teacher and heir. Frankie saw in Capone the promise of something bigger, something that could outgrow the small-time chaos of Brooklyn. The kid had ambition that didn't fit in New York anymore. You could feel in the way he talked, the way he looked at the city, like it was too small for him. One night, as they closed up the bar, Frankie said, "You ever think about going west?" Capone frowned. "West of where?" "Chicago," Frankie said. "They're just getting started out there. Johnny Torrio's running things. He's smart. He could use a kid like you." Capone hesitated. He liked Brooklyn, liked the noise, the girls, the feeling of being someone. But Frankie's tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was destiny being nudged along. "You go where the money's growing," Yale said. "You stay too long in one place, you rot." Before he left, Capone worked one last summer at the Harvard Inn. It was a season of fire and music, the place busier than ever, the crowd wild, the profits endless. But beneath the laughter, change was coming. Prohibition was about to hit, and Frankie was preparing for war disguised as business. He stocked up on liquor, bought warehouses, bribed shipping clerks. When the law banned alcohol, he'd already have an empire waiting to fill the void. Capone saw it all and marveled at how far the man for Brooklyn's docks had come. Yale was more than a gangster. He was a visionary. And that vision was ruthless. A few weeks before Capone left, a fight broke out at the bar, a bad one. A drunken sailor insulted one of Yale's girls, and Capone stepped in, quick and brutal. In the scuffle, the sailor slashed him across the face with a knife. The wound ran from ear to lip, deep, ugly, permanent. The room went still. Capone didn't cry out. He didn't even blink. He just turned, eyes full of fury, and beat the man until he couldn't stand. When it was over, blood dripping from his cheek, Frankie handed him a towel. "That scar," he said quietly, "is going to make you famous." He was right. In the days that followed, Frankie treated the wound himself, applying ointment, joking lightly to distract him from the pain. But underneath the humor was something deeper, a bond. He cared about the kid in his own way, though he'd never say it. In their world, affection was weakness. Yet everyone in the inn knew Frankie Yale and Al Capone weren't just boss and employee anymore. They were brothers in ambition. When the day came for Capone to leave for Chicago, the two met early in the morning. The city was still asleep, the air heavy with fog. Frankie stood by his car, a cigarette dangling from his lips, watching as Capone loaded his suitcase into a taxi. "You sure about this?" Yale asked. Capone nodded. "You told me once, boss. Don't rot." Frankie smiled, half proud, half sad. "Remember what I taught you. Don't start fights you can't finish. Don't let anyone see you sweat. And don't forget where you came from." Capone grinned through the scars. "Brooklyn, right?" "Brooklyn," Frankie said softly. "Always." As the cab drove off, Frankie stood in the dawn light, hands in his pockets, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. For a moment, he let himself feel something close to nostalgia. He'd seen men come and go, rise and fall, but this one felt different. There was something inevitable about Capone, like watching a storm form on the horizon. The months that followed were quieter. Without Capone, the Harvard Inn felt a little emptier. The laughter seemed thinner, the nights longer. Frankie threw himself into work, expanding his operations, running liquor up the coast, solidifying his alliances. His name carried weight now, not just in Brooklyn, but across the eastern seaboard. Everyone wanted a piece of Yale's network. Politicians, mobsters, cops, they all came to his table. He played them like a card game he'd already won. Then came the call from Chicago. Torrio had taken Capone under his wing, just as Yale predicted. Within a year, the kid was running parts of Torrio's operations: brothels, gambling dens, supply chains. He was ruthless, efficient, and fearless. Every newspaper headline that mentioned his name was a quiet echo of Yale's own success. The student was rising. Frankie followed Capone's ascent from afar, reading about his exploits with a mixture of pride and unease. He had taught the boy everything he knew: patience, presentation, control. But Capone had something Yale never did: fame. He craved it, courted it, bathed in it. Where Frankie preferred shadows, Capone wanted the spotlight. He wanted the world to know his name. And that, Yale knew, was dangerous. Fame attracted attention. Attention attracted enemies. But for now it was working. The Chicago outfit was growing, and Yale's shipments fed it. The two men kept in touch: letters, phone calls, discreet messengers. It was business as usual, except the stakes were higher. Prohibition had turned crime into industry, and Yale was a major supplier. Capone was his best customer. Together, they built a bridge between Brooklyn and Chicago, a whiskey-fueled highway of profit and trust. Yet as the money piled up, so did the paranoia. The bootlegging wars grew bloodier, the betrayals faster. Men were shot for less than a rumor. Yale kept his composure, but even he could feel the tension tightening around him. The empire he'd built on loyalty was starting to show cracks. The new generation of gangsters wasn't like him. They didn't negotiate. They didn't respect the old ways. They took what they wanted and left nothing standing. Frankie watched it unfold with quiet disappointment. The thing he'd helped create was evolving into something he could barely recognize. And then came the phone call that changed everything. A contact in Chicago told him there'd been trouble. Torrio had been shot, nearly killed. Capone had taken over. Just like that, the kid from Coney Island was now the most powerful bootlegger in America. Frankie hung up the phone and sat in silence. He wasn't surprised. He'd always known Capone was destined for greatness. But he also knew that the same ambition that made him unstoppable would one day make him dangerous. In the weeks that followed, shipments between Chicago and Brooklyn doubled. The money was incredible, almost absurd, but so was the risk. Police raids, hijackings, rival crews. The cost of business was blood. Still, Frankie kept his composure. He'd always believed that calm was the sharpest weapon in chaos. But sometimes, even calm can't stop fate. Late one night, as he counted the week's earnings, he paused over a letter from Chicago. The handwriting was familiar, bold, hurried, confident. "Everything's bigger here, boss," it said. "The money, the noise, the enemies. But don't worry. I remember what you taught me. Always Brooklyn." Frankie smiled, folding the letter carefully, sliding it into his coat pocket. He didn't know it then, but that line, "Always Brooklyn," would echo in his mind years later, when loyalty and betrayal finally collided. For now, though, he was content. The kid he'd mentored was running the show in Chicago, and Yale himself was untouchable in New York. The empire was strong. The system worked. The game was his. But every empire built on blood eventually demands payment. Frankie had given Capone his start, his philosophy, even his code. What he didn't realize was that he'd also given him something else: the blueprint for betrayal. And somewhere, beneath the soft hum of the Harvard Inn, with the lights glowing gold against the dark sea, Frankie Yale couldn't shake the strange feeling that the student he'd taught to be silent might one day be the one to break that silence with bullets. Chapter 6: The Brooklyn Empire. The roar of the ocean had always been the rhythm of Frankie Yale's life. Steady, endless, and impossible to silence. By the early 1920s, that sound had become the background score to an empire. Brooklyn was no longer just his home. It was his kingdom. The Harvard still pulsed with energy every night, but it was no longer the center of Yale's world. It was just the showroom, a place where laughter and liquor distracted the public from the machinery of power humming beneath the surface. Behind the barroom charm, Yale's network stretched across boroughs, through warehouses, docks, and speakeasies, weaving a web of influence that few in New York could match. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was an institution. Prohibition had turned ordinary men into millionaires, and Yale was one of the first to see the full scope of it. The law had tried to dry up America, but it only soaked in opportunity. Every barrel of whiskey was a fortune, every bottle a weapon. The city's thirst for alcohol was insatiable, and Frankie made sure it never went unquenched. His trucks rolled in and out of Brooklyn day and night, disguised as bakeries, dairies, and funeral deliveries. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the man who ran one of the city's busiest funeral parlors was also supplying half of New York with illegal liquor. The dead paid for the living's entertainment, and Yale made money from both ends of the line. He was methodical about everything. He ran his rackets like a corporation, departments, managers, ledgers. Every man had his place, every job had its price. Frankie was no longer the street brawler from Coney Island. He had become a businessman in all but name. But unlike most businessmen, he could erase competition with a single nod. When rivals tried to undercut him, accidents happened. A warehouse fire, a missing truck, a sudden disappearance. Violence was never random with Frankie. It was calculated. He understood that chaos scared customers, and customers were what made his empire breathe. His goal wasn't terror, it was control. His money bought everything: silence from the police, loyalty from his men, even admiration from the public. He donated to churches, handed out food to families, and attended parades with the calm confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. People called him the gentleman gangster, the man who wore silk while others wore scars. It wasn't just a nickname, it was his strategy. Fear could only carry you so far. Charm could take you the rest of the way. By 1922, Yale's network stretched far beyond Brooklyn. He controlled the docks where shipments arrived, the trucks that carried them, and the bars that sold them. His reach extended into Manhattan and Queens, even creeping toward the Bronx. Every bottle of rum, every crate of beer, all of it passed through his invisible toll gate. The profits were staggering, and so were the temptations. But Frankie kept a tight rein on his operation. He didn't gamble, didn't drink much, and didn't trust anyone who couldn't keep their mouth shut. Discipline had built his empire, and discipline would keep it standing. Still, the streets weren't quiet. The old gangs were collapsing, eaten alive by greed and paranoia. Men who had been friends one year were shooting at each other the next. The Black Hand had faded into memory, replaced by something far more organized, far more dangerous. The Mafia, the word whispered in fear, was taking shape in the shadows. And at its heart were men like Frankie Yale and Joe, the boss Masuria, carving up New York one neighborhood at a time. Frankie didn't crave titles. He didn't call himself a don or a boss. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew who held the cards. What made Yale different was that he wasn't a brute. He believed in order, in rules, in an underworld that functioned like the world above it. Predictable, professional, profitable. He held meetings with his top men like board conferences, discussing routes, logistics, and alliances. His lieutenants weren't thugs. They were executives who carried guns. And yet, no matter how civilized he made it look, blood was still the ink that signed every deal. His closest partners understood his rhythm. Men like John Scalise, Louis Capone, no relation to Al, and Frank Aluccio, all loyal, all aware that Yale's calm smile could freeze in a stone in a heartbeat. There was a story that one of his men once stole a shipment of whiskey to sell on the side. When Yale found out, he didn't yell or threaten. He invited the man to dinner. They ate, laughed, drank wine. When the plates were cleared, Yale stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and shot him once through the heart. Then he sat back down and finished his meal. That was Frankie, emotionless, precise, unstoppable. Meanwhile, The connection with Chicago had only grown stronger. Al Capone, the kid he'd once hired as a bouncer, was now ruling the Windy City's underworld with the same quiet ruthlessness Yale had taught him. Their relationship had evolved into something like business partners. Yale the supplier, Capone the distributor. Ships carrying Canadian whiskey would dock in New York under Yale's protection, and from there, Capone's men would move the product west. The arrangement was smooth, profitable, and built on mutual respect, at least for a while. Frankie liked to think of himself as a man who could balance both worlds, the light and the dark. During the day, he was a respectable businessman, owner of Yale's funeral home on Fifth Avenue. He wore immaculate suits, tipped his hat to priests, and sent flowers to the widows of the men he'd buried, some of whom he'd put there himself. At night, he was something else, the shadow behind the curtain, the silent conductor of Brooklyn's symphony of crime. Few men could navigate both lives without losing their soul, but Frankie had learned long ago that souls were bad for business. He even found time for family. He had a wife, Maria, and 2 daughters. At home, he was quieter, gentler, almost tender. He read newspapers, listened to the radio, and pretended for a few hours that he was just another man living the American dream. But the illusion never lasted long. There were always calls to take, visitors to see, problems to solve. His wife knew what he was, but she never asked. In their world, truth was just another form of danger. Despite the calm on the surface, the tides were shifting beneath him. Other gangs were watching Yale's success with envy. Joe Masuria, the so-called boss of bosses, began to see Frankie as both ally and threat. The 2 men had worked together for years, dividing territories, maintaining peace. But peace in the underworld was a fragile thing. It lasted only as long as everyone profited equally. And Masuria didn't like equals. He wanted subordinates. Frankie wasn't built to bow. Rumors started to spread. Whispers that Yale was too independent, that he was building something even bigger behind Masuria's back. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In a mafia, rumor was just as deadly as fact. Frankie ignored it at first. He believed he could keep the peace through respect. But the guns were already being loaded. The first sign came in the form of a message, a coded warning from one of his informants. There was talk of betrayal, of meetings happening without his knowledge. Frankie knew better than to panic. Instead, he doubled down, tightening his inner circle, watching everyone closely. He started traveling with more bodyguards, but still moved with the same casual confidence. To outsiders, nothing had changed. To insiders, everything had. Meanwhile, his funeral business kept growing. People joked that no one handled death in Brooklyn like Frankie Yale. It was macabre but true. He'd built a reputation for discretion and dignity. Politicians came to him quietly when they needed inconvenient bodies buried quickly. The irony was that the man responsible for so much death was also the one who made it look beautiful. His funerals were immaculate. White flowers, polished caskets, solemn hymns. To some, it was redemption. To others, it was mockery. To Frankie, it was just business. He moved through his world with the confidence of a man who had mastered it. But beneath that confidence was something darker, a growing fatigue. He'd spent years building, fighting, surviving. The violence never stopped. It just changed shape. He was surrounded by money, luxury, and power. Yet there were moments, usually late at night, when the silence of his own success pressed down on him. The price of being untouchable was isolation. He couldn't trust anyone completely, not even a man who called him boss. One evening, as he sat alone in his office above the funeral parlor, counting receipts from his liquor shipments, a soft knock interrupted him. It was one of his lieutenants, a nervous man named DeMarco. "Boss," he said, "word is Chicago's having trouble. Capone's asking if we can increase the next shipment." Frankie looked up slowly, cigarette glowing between his fingers. "We'll send what we can," he said. "Tell him Brooklyn's still open for business." He didn't show it, but the request unsettled him. Trouble in Chicago meant trouble everywhere. And where there was trouble, there was betrayal. The next few months blurred together. Meetings, shipments, payoffs, quiet threats. The police cracked down harder. Raids became riskier, and Yale's men started dying faster. But the money was still good. Too good to walk away from. Frankie pushed on, as he always did. When one door closed, he opened another. When one man fell, he replaced him. That was the rhythm of power. Relentless, unforgiving, endless. And yet, for all his control, cracks began to appear. Some of his trucks were hijacked. A shipment went missing on its way to Chicago. Another was found burned out in Jersey. Frankie sent word to Capone, asking for answers. None came. Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived, short and cold. Maybe someone on your end skimming. Keep your eyes open. It wasn't an accusation, not directly, but the implication was there. The trust between them, the bond that had once been unbreakable, had started to splinter. Frankie tried to shake it off. He told himself Capone was just being careful. But deep down, he knew what it meant. In their world, suspicion was the first sign of death. It was the invisible line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. He'd taught Capone how to build power, how to keep control, and now the student was using those lessons against him. Still, Yale carried on. The Brooklyn nights were busier than ever, the clubs louder, the money thicker. On the surface, he was the same man, calm, charming, untouchable. But those close to him noticed subtle changes. The late-night pacing, the extra guards outside his home, the way his eyes lingered longer on every handshake, every smile. He was reading people constantly, looking for the crack in the mask. And yet, even in his caution, he refused to run. Frankie Yale wasn't built to hide. He had built an empire from nothing, and he would die standing before he let anyone take it. That was the law he lived by, the law that had carried him from the docks to the top of New York's underworld. One night, as he stood on the roof of his building, watching the lights of Brooklyn shimmer against the Black River, he thought about the boy he'd once been, the one who dreamed of control, of respect, of never having to bow to anyone again. He had achieved all of it, and yet, as the cold wind brushed against his face, he realized the irony. The higher you climbed in this world, the more enemies you created below. The empire he built in Brooklyn was strong, yes, but not unbreakable. Empires never were. They were made of men, and men were made of fear, greed, and ego. He'd built his life on loyalty, but even loyalty had an expiration date. The streets whispered that the world was changing again, that younger, hungrier men were coming. Men who didn't believe in rules or restraint. Men who saw Frankie Yale not as a legend, but as an obstacle. As dawn broke over the harbor, Yale lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift away like ghosts over the water. He thought about all the men he'd buried, all the fortunes he'd made, all the lives he'd shaped. Brooklyn was his, yes, but for how much longer? He didn't know the answer, and maybe he didn't want to. Because in this life, questions like that only had one ending. And somewhere across the distance, in the streets of Chicago, Al Capone, the boy who once learned silence from him, was listening to whispers of his own. Whispers about missing shipments, lost profits, betrayal. Whispers that would soon travel back east like a storm, carrying the sound of engines and gunfire. The student was growing impatient. The teacher's kingdom was beginning to tremble. And in the heart of Brooklyn, Frankie Yale, master of calm and chaos, was about to learn that even the most carefully built empires eventually sink into the sea. Chapter 7. Capone Moves West. The train that carried Al Capone out of New York rumbled like a promise, a steel heartbeat cutting across the country. It was 1919, and the boy from Brooklyn was leaving home, chasing a dream that wasn't his own yet, but would soon belong to him entirely. Frankie Yale had sent him west with a nod and a quiet smile, the kind of smile that hid both pride and prediction. He knew the kid would make it big. He just didn't know how big, or how dangerous. Chicago was waiting, and in the fog of that city's streets, Capone would rise faster than anyone had imagined. But behind every rise, there's a shadow, and that shadow still lived in Brooklyn. It was Frankie's world, the empire he'd built brick by brick, deal by deal. And though miles now separated them, Their stories were still bound together by blood, ambition, and the unspoken truth that one man's success would one day become the other's downfall. When Capone arrived in Chicago, it wasn't the city of shining lights the newspapers liked to print about. It was a rough, sprawling beast, smoke-choked, violent, and divided. On the surface, it was a working man's town, built on factories, stockyards, and sweat. But underneath, it was chaos. Gangs ruled every block, each claiming a piece of the liquor trade that had exploded since Prohibition began. The police were on every payroll. Politicians played both sides. Chicago wasn't a city. It was a war disguised as commerce. And for Al Capone, it felt like home. Johnny Torrio, Yale's old associate, was waiting for him. Torrio had left Brooklyn years earlier to build something greater, an organized criminal network that operated like a business. He wasn't a brute like the gangsters of old. He was a strategist, calm and collected, much like Yale. Torrio saw in Capone what Yale had seen, potential, wrapped in fire. He put him to work immediately, first as muscle, then as manager. And just like that, the kid from Coney Island started climbing. Back in Brooklyn, Frankie watched the reports come in through the papers and whispers on the street. Capone's name was growing. The Chicago outfit, as Torrio's empire came to be known, was expanding faster than anyone thought possible. Speakeasies, distilleries, protection rackets, all falling into their hands. And somewhere in those profits was a piece of Yale's own fortune. The shipments that left Brooklyn's docks under Frankie's control often ended up in Chicago warehouses. Yale was supplying the liquor. Capone was selling it. The teacher and student were still partners, for now. Frankie liked that arrangement. It was clean, efficient, and profitable. The Atlantic Ocean brought him rum from the Caribbean, whiskey from Canada, and gin from secret stills upstate. His men loaded it into trucks disguised as bakery deliveries or funeral cars, and from there, it spread across the country. Chicago was one of his biggest buyers, and Capone made sure those payments always came on time. Envelopes stuffed with cash, delivered by men who spoke little and bowed deeply. For years, it worked perfectly, but success has a way of changing people. The quiet kid who used to take orders was now giving them. Capone was becoming something Yale never intended him to be, a celebrity. Newspapers loved him. The man who smiled for cameras, threw lavish parties, and walked the streets of Chicago surrounded by bodyguards and jazz. He was the new face of American crime, bold and loud and untouchable. Frankie didn't understand it. In his world, silence was strength. Fame was weakness. You didn't announce power. You let people feel it. But the times were changing, and Capone was the embodiment of that change. The distance between them grew wider, not just in miles but in philosophy. Yale still ruled Brooklyn with precision, every move calculated, every word measured. He preferred the shadows. Capone bathed in light, yet they still needed each other. Yale's network kept Capone's empire alive, and Capone's money kept Yale's men fed. For all their differences, they were bound by the same unspoken law, loyalty to profit. By 1924, Yale's empire in Brooklyn was unmatched. His control of the docks made him indispensable. No liquor entered the city without his permission. He was untouchable, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. But the old alliances that had protected him were beginning to crack. Joe Masuria's ambition was growing. Rival gangs in Manhattan and the Bronx were pushing harder. And the police, under pressure from reformers, were suddenly less predictable. For the first time in years, Yale felt the ground shifting beneath him. One night, as he sat in his office above the funeral home, smoking quietly, one of his men brought in a telegram. It was from Chicago, a short message from Capone himself. Need a favor. Some people out here don't respect money. Handle it. Frankie read it twice, then smiled faintly. Tell him I'll send flowers, he said. That was their code. When Yale sent flowers, it meant a man was about to disappear. Weeks later, a Chicago gang leader known for hijacking Capone's liquor shipments was found dead outside his home, riddled with bullets. No one in Chicago had done it. It was Yale's men, sent quietly from New York, precise and professional. Capone was grateful. He sent a thank you letter written in his secretary's handwriting, ending with, "Brooklyn forever." Frankie poured himself a drink that night, staring at the letter. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt something colder, the creeping sense that his protege was getting used to giving orders, not taking them. Chicago's war was escalating. Torrio had been shot, barely survived, and retired. Capone took over completely. The newspapers called him Scarface, a name he hated but couldn't escape. He was the face of crime in America now, untouchable, unpredictable, and terrifying. But with power came paranoia. He trusted no one, and every shadow looked like betrayal. The same qualities Yale had drilled into him, caution, calculation, suspicion, now turned inward. And soon, those suspicions would point back east. Yale's business was still booming, but something was off. Shipments meant for Chicago started arriving light. A few crates short here, a few barrels missing there. Frankie's men blamed hijackers. Capone's men blamed Yale. At first, both sides stayed polite. Capone sent letters asking for clarity. Yale sent reassurances. But the missing shipments didn't stop. Capone's patience began to thin. And Frankie, proud, stubborn, unwilling to admit any weakness, refused to grovel. He'd been a mentor, not a servant. He wasn't about to start bowing to a man who'd once worked his door. Meanwhile, Brooklyn itself was changing. The quiet control Yale had maintained was unraveling. New gangs were rising, young, reckless, unafraid of him. They didn't remember the old rules. They didn't care who Frankie Yale was. They only cared about the money. Shootings became common again. A truck of Yale's was hijacked on Flatbush Avenue in broad daylight. A cop found dead 2 blocks away. It was chaos creeping back into the kingdom he'd once ruled with silence. Through it all, Frankie remained composed. To the outside world, he was still the gentleman gangster, sharp suits, quiet voice, calm smile. But inside, he felt the pressure mounting. He knew too much, trusted too little, and slept too rarely. He'd survived too many wars to believe in luck anymore. There was a feeling in the air, like the city itself was holding its breath. Something was coming. Then came the call from Chicago. A voice Frankie didn't recognize asked for him by name. "Mr. Yale," the man said. "Mr. Capone sends his regards. He wants to discuss the recent problems personally." Frankie frowned. Capone never called himself. He sent letters, messengers, gifts, not phone calls. "Tell him I'll be in touch," Yale replied, and hung up. But he knew, even as he said it, that something had shifted. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew thicker. Some of Yale's lieutenants began to whisper. Maybe it was time to cut ties with Chicago, they said. Focus on New York. But cutting ties in that world was like cutting a wire attached to dynamite. Sooner or later, something was going to blow. Frankie tried to smooth things over, sent fresh shipments, even included a few bonus crates as a gesture of goodwill. But by then, it was too late. Capone's empire had grown too large, his paranoia too deep. He no longer saw Yale as a partner. He saw him as a risk. The irony wasn't lost on Frankie. He'd built his entire life teaching others that fear was a tool, not a master. Yet here he was, being hunted by his own lessons. In his quieter moments, he thought about that. How every man he'd ever mentored had either died or turned against him. Maybe that was the curse of power. You could create loyalty, but you could never own it forever. One night, sitting in the back room of the Harvard Inn, Frankie poured himself a drink and stared at the reflection of the bar lights in his glass. The music was low, the laughter outside distant. He thought about the kid he'd met years ago, the one with the loud laugh and the fearless grin, the one who'd called him boss. He wondered if Capone remembered those nights, the lessons, the loyalty, the moments that made him who he was. Maybe he did. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe remembering was the reason he couldn't let Frankie live. By 1927, rumors began circulating through New York's underworld. Chicago was sending men east. No one knew why, or maybe no one wanted to say. Frankie ignored them. He'd heard threats before. He'd buried every man who ever tried to scare him. But deep down, something felt different this time. Capone wasn't a rival. He was family. And betrayal from family was the only kind that really hurt. That spring, one of Yale's trucks disappeared. It was carrying expensive scotch, bound for Chicago. Days later, the truck was found abandoned on a country road, the driver dead, the cargo gone. A note had been pinned to the body. "This is business." Frankie read it once, twice, then burned it in an ashtray. His face stayed calm, but his hands trembled slightly. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't have to. The message was clear. The student had declared war on the teacher. Still, Frankie didn't retaliate. He couldn't. A full-scale conflict between Brooklyn and Chicago would destroy both. Instead, he waited. He watched. He moved quietly through his days, the weight of inevitability pressing heavier each night. He knew the end when he felt it, the way animals sense storms before they arrive. And in the pit of his stomach, the thunder was already rolling. One evening, as he left his office, the city lights stretched before him, endless, glittering, deceptive. The same lights he'd chased his whole life. The same lights that made him believe he'd outrun fate. He buttoned his coat, stepped into his car, and told his driver to head home. The streets were quiet, the tires humming softly against the asphalt. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would settle again. That Capone would cool off, that the empire he built would survive. But deep down, Frankie Yale knew better. He always had. The moment he put Capone on that train west, he'd sealed his fate. You can teach someone everything you know, how to think, how to lead, how to survive, but you can't teach them not to outgrow you. The kid from Brooklyn was now the king of Chicago, and kings don't share thrones. As the car turned onto 23rd Avenue, Frankie looked out the window, watching the lights flicker against the dark sky. He thought of the sea again, the endless rhythm that had followed him all his life. The sound of waves crashing, steady and unchanging. Somewhere out there, the tide was pulling back, preparing to crash one last time. And in that quiet moment, as Brooklyn drifted by his window, Frankie Yale, the man who had taught silence to killers and manners to gangsters, understood the cruelest truth of all. The student always inherits the teacher's ghosts. And as we're already on their way from Chicago, riding fast, carrying a gift wrapped in smoke and gunfire. Chapter 8. The Business of Murder. It was the spring of 1928, and Brooklyn's nights had begun to feel heavier, like the air itself carried secrets. The sound of jazz still spilled from the Harvard Inn, but beneath the music there was a strange, quiet tension, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the moment before thunder. Frankie Yale sat at his usual table near the back, his hands folded neatly over a glass of scotch. To anyone watching, he looked like a man at ease, a king surveying his court. But inside, Frankie was listening, not to the music, not to the chatter, but to the rhythm of danger tightening around him. For years he had lived by the code of calm, but even calm men can hear the footsteps of death when it starts to follow too closely. The liquor business had become bloodier than ever. What began as a trade of bottles and barrels had evolved into something colder, an industry where shipments were guarded like gold, and every deal came with a gun at the table. Frankie had helped design that system. He'd built it on precision, trust, and silence. But now, that same system was turning in on itself. Each gang wanted more control. Every boss wanted a bigger piece. Chicago's wars were spilling into New York, and whispers were beginning to reach his ears that some of the violence traced back to him, or at least to his name. He knew what the whispers meant. Capone's men had been moving differently. Fewer letters, shorter calls, delays in payments. In his world, silence wasn't a pause. It was a prelude. Still, Frankie played it cool. He continued his work, managing shipments, attending funerals, keeping up appearances. The newspapers still wrote about him with a kind of fascination, calling him the gentleman of Brooklyn, the gangster who never shouted, never showed blood on his hands. But that reputation had its cost. To survive in that world, you couldn't just be feared. You had to be useful. And lately, Frankie was starting to feel like a man who'd outlived his usefulness. Across the country, Al Capone's power was absolute. Chicago trembled at his name. He controlled everything from breweries to brothels, and his influence reached deep into politics and law enforcement. But his empire, for all its size, was leaking. Rival gangs were hijacking shipments, skimming profits, and defying his authority. Someone had to be blamed. And when the missing shipments were traced back to Brooklyn, Frankie Yale's name came up like a ghost from the past, a name that had once meant loyalty. Now, it sounded like betrayal. In truth, Frankie wasn't skimming. He didn't need to. His own operations were profitable enough. But Capone didn't deal in truth. He dealt in perception. The numbers didn't add up, and someone had to pay for that. In Capone's mind, loyalty wasn't a memory. It was a transaction, and one that expired when trust did. The first warning came in the form of a rumor, passed through one of Yale's men who'd been in Chicago. "They're saying you shorted him," the man whispered. "Capone thinks you're bleeding him." Frankie had smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Capone's too smart for gossip," he said. But when the man left, Frankie's expression changed. He poured himself another drink and stared into the amber glass for a long time. He knew what rumors could do. He'd used them himself many times to destroy men stronger than him. That night, as the band played a slow tune and the lights dimmed, Frankie felt something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of vulnerability. He'd built his life on control, on knowing every move before it was made. But now, someone else was writing the next move, and he didn't know what it would be. He tightened his operations. He doubled the guards on his trucks, shuffled routes, replaced drivers. He even began to handle some shipments personally, overseeing deliveries to remind Chicago that he was still in command. It was pride, yes, but it was also strategy. If he showed strength, maybe it would buy him time. But time, like trust, was running out. In May, one of his shipments vanished completely. No trace, no witnesses. His men swore they'd followed protocol. Frankie didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply dismissed them and sat alone in his office, tapping his cigarette against the edge of his desk. "They're testing me," he murmured. "They want to see how I react." And they were right. Across the miles, in Chicago, Capone was watching too. Reports came back from his men, each one dripping with half-truths. Yale's shipments were late. His drivers were nervous. Some were talking to rivals. It was enough to plant the seed of doubt. And Capone was a man who didn't let doubt grow without cutting something down first. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, life continued like nothing was wrong. Frankie still attended church on Sundays. He still sent flowers to funerals, gifts to weddings, money to the poor. But even his gestures of goodwill began to feel like eulogies, small acts of peace in a world preparing for war. His wife noticed at first the change in him. The way he lingered by the window at night, watching the street below. The way he'd pause mid-conversation, as if listening for something that wasn't there yet. One evening, over dinner, she asked softly, "Are you in trouble, Frankie?" He looked up from his plate, smiled faintly, and said, "Only the kind that comes with breathing." She didn't press further. She'd learned long ago that some answers were more dangerous than the questions themselves. In early June, one of Yale's oldest allies, Joe Gallucci, was shot outside his own restaurant. The papers called it a robbery. Frankie knew better. The man had been part of his inner circle, one of the few who'd known the full map of his operations. His death wasn't random. It was surgical. Someone was dismantling him, piece by piece. Frankie held a private funeral at his own parlor. The room was filled with flowers, soft music, and the quiet sobs of wives who had buried too many men like him. As he stood beside the casket, Frankie's expression never changed. To the mourners, he looked like a man of unshakable composure. But inside he was counting who showed up, who didn't, who kept their distance. Every absence told him something. Every handshake told him more. After the funeral, he went straight to the Harvard Inn. The place was crowded, as it always was, but it felt different now. The laughter was too loud, the smiles too forced. Frankie sat in his usual spot, listening, watching, scanning faces. He could feel the cracks widening. Brooklyn was still his, but not the way it used to be. Too many young men wanted his throne, and too many of his old ones were wondering when the king would fall. That night, as he walked home, a car slowed beside him. It was one of his own, or at least it used to be. The driver leaned out, nervous. "Boss," he said, "you should lay low for a while. Maybe take a trip." Frankie stopped, turned, and looked him in the eye. "You think I'm hiding?" he asked quietly. The driver hesitated. "No, sir. Just maybe it's time to rest." Frankie's expression didn't change. "Rest is for the dead," he said, and kept walking. In Chicago, Capone's mind was already made up. The reports kept coming, each one confirming what he wanted to believe, that Yale had betrayed him. Whether it was true or not didn't matter anymore. The bond that had once been their foundation had cracked beyond repair. Frankie had been his teacher, his mentor, the man who taught him how to play the game. But Capone was the kind of player who believed the game only ended when one man was left standing. On June 24th, a final message arrived in Brooklyn. A short, cryptic phone call. "Tell Mr. Yale," the voice said, "that the Chicago shipments are settled. He won't need to worry about them anymore." The line went dead before the operator could trace it. Frankie listened as his secretary repeated the words. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He understood exactly what it meant. For the next few days, he moved quietly. He kept his routines, but shortened his hours. He stopped attending late-night meetings, avoided unfamiliar faces. But no one, not even Frankie Yale, could hide forever. He had lived too long in the open, too long in the same rhythm. The men who were coming for him didn't need to search. They just needed to wait. On July 1st, 1928, the sun rose hot and heavy over Brooklyn. Frankie woke early, dressed sharply as always, and kissed his wife on the cheek before leaving. "You'll be home for dinner?" she asked. "Always am," he replied. It was the last lie he'd ever tell her. He spent the morning visiting one of his businesses, a construction site near the docks. Around 3 in the afternoon, he got a call at his office. The man on the line said there had been trouble with a shipment, an emergency that needed his attention. Frankie sighed, grabbed his hat, and headed for his Lincoln sedan. His driver opened the door, and they set off through the crowded Brooklyn streets. The city was loud that afternoon, vendors shouting, kids playing, traffic honking. The noise almost drowned out the sound of the car that began to follow them a few blocks later. Frankie noticed it only once, reflected in the mirror, a dark sedan keeping pace. His driver asked, "You want me to lose them?" Frankie shook his head. "No, let's see where they're going." They didn't have to wait long. As they turned onto 65th Street, the car behind them sped up. Frankie turned his head just as the first burst of gunfire shattered the silence. The air filled with the scream of engines and the rattle of submachine guns. The first time the Tommy gun had ever been used in a New York killing. Bullets tore through glass, metal, flesh. Frankie's car swerved, slammed into a parked vehicle, and came to a stop. The other car sped off, leaving only smoke and silence behind. When the police arrived, they found Yale slumped over the steering wheel, his hands still gripping it tight. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as if death had arrived like an old acquaintance. The back of his head was a ruin. His Lincoln was riddled with holes. In his pocket, they found his gold watch, a few $100s, and a small silver cross. The newspaper the next day called it the most brutal murder New York had ever seen. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. But everyone knew. The whispers pointed west, toward Chicago, toward the man Yale had once called his student. The story spread quickly. How Capone had sent the killers. How the Tommy gun had sung its metallic requiem for Brooklyn's gentleman gangster. Whether it was revenge, business, or both, no one could say for sure. But everyone agreed on one thing. The teacher had been executed by his own lesson. In the days that followed, the city mourned him. His funeral was massive. Hundreds of cars, thousands of mourners, a procession of flowers that stretched for blocks. Even priests attended, blessing the man whose sins were too many to count. His casket was polished, his suit immaculate, his hands folded neatly, as if he were only sleeping. Maria wept quietly, her daughters clutching her hands. Outside, cameras flashed, capturing the last image of the man who had once ruled Brooklyn with silence. For years afterward, his story was told in whispers, not as a cautionary tale, but as a legend. The man who taught the underworld how to behave like businessmen. The man who could turn a murder into a negotiation. The man who built an empire out of shadows and died under the sun. And somewhere in Chicago, Al Capone poured himself a drink and raised a glass. No words, no toast, no regret. Just silence. The same silence Frankie had always preached. The business of murder had come full circle, and its final transaction had been paid in full. Chapter 9. A Man of Two Worlds. The day after Frankie Yale's funeral, Brooklyn woke up to silence. The kind of silence that comes after thunder, when the storm has spent its fury and the world is left trying to remember what it sounded like before. The newspapers had already printed their stories. Some called him a gangster, others a businessman, some even a misunderstood man who brought order to chaos. But the truth of Frankie Yale didn't live in the headlines. It lived in the contradiction he had become. The man who wore prayer beads in one hand and blood on the other. The man who could host a dinner for priests on Sunday and order a killing on Monday. Even in death, he remained what he had always been, a man of two worlds, forever walking the tightrope between the sacred and the damned. In life, Frankie had built that duality carefully. It was his armor. He was the respectable family man who owned a funeral home, who donated to the church, who handed out money to widows at Christmas. His neighbors called him Signor Yule, a pillar of the Italian community. But behind those polished shoes and polite nods, another man lurked, the one they didn't invite to dinner, the one who made problems disappear and fortunes appear in their place. That was the Frankie Yale the streets knew, the one who ruled Brooklyn without ever needing to shout. Both men were real. Both were him. And maybe that was his greatest trick, that he could live as both and convince the world they were one and the same. He had always been good at that. Even as a young man, Frankie knew how to blend in. To the dock workers, he was one of them. To the shop owners, he was protection. To the cops, he was cooperation. To the priests, he was penance. He gave everyone what they needed to see, and in return, they gave him power. That was his genius. Power, he once told a friend, wasn't about being stronger. It was about being necessary. And for a time, he was necessary to everyone. The irony was that Frankie's most legitimate business was also his most symbolic, the funeral home. It was clean, quiet, and perfectly respectable. It gave him a face that mothers could trust and children could wave to. But to those who really knew, it was more than just a business. It was a front, yes, a way to move money, to hide shipments, to control the comings and goings of the dead. But it was also something deeper. In that line of work, he saw what few men dare to face. Every week, bodies came through his doors. Men who had laughed in his bar, drunk his whiskey, shared his deals. In death, they all looked the same. Rich or poor, boss or worker, saint or sinner, they all lay still. And in those quiet moments, when he stood alone in the embalming room, the smell of roses mixing with formaldehyde, maybe even Frankie wondered which version of himself would end up in one of his own caskets. People liked to imagine gangsters as men without reflection, all violence and vice. But Frankie Yale was different. He was introspective in his own strange way. He never spoke about it, but those closest to him said he often sat in silence for hours after a killing, not out of guilt, but contemplation. He would stare into a drink, lost in thought, as if weighing the scales between what was right and what was necessary. In his world, those two things were never the same. Right got men killed. Necessary kept them alive. There's a story, maybe a myth, maybe not, about a night a priest came to his bar. The man was young, new to the parish, full of fire and righteousness. He walked in, collar shining white against the smoke, and told Frankie he wanted him to stop the killings. "You've done enough harm to this neighborhood," the priest said. "These people look up to you. They fear you. You could do so much good." Frankie didn't respond at first. He poured the priest a drink instead. "I don't drink," the priest said. Frankie smiled faintly. "Then I'll drink for both of us." He took a sip, leaned in, and said, "Father, the world doesn't work the way you think it does. You pray for peace. I buy it. Which one of us do you think they listen to?" The priest left without answering, and Frankie sat there, staring at the untouched glass across from him, as if it had asked a question he couldn't quite answer either. That was the paradox of his life, that he believed himself to be a man who brought order, not chaos. In his mind, every deal, every beating, every death had a purpose. Without men like him, he used to say, the streets would be worse. To Frankie, he wasn't the disease, he was the cure. He just never realized the cure was killing him, too. His wife Maria saw both men clearly, though she pretended she didn't. She loved the husband who came home smelling of cologne and cigars, who kissed his daughters goodnight, who sat by the window and smoked quietly while the city glowed below. She hated the man who vanished for days, who came home with blood on his cuff and silence in his eyes. She never asked questions, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. In her heart, she knew the answers. When people whispered his name, she'd defend him fiercely. "My husband provides for this neighborhood," she'd say. And it was true. He did. He just provided in ways no one could talk about in daylight. The neighborhood loved him because he made them feel protected. When a shop was robbed, Yale's men found the thief. When a woman was harassed, he handled it. When a family couldn't pay rent, he covered it. But everything came with a price. Sometimes money, sometimes silence, sometimes loyalty. In his eyes, it wasn't exploitation. It was balance. He gave and he took in equal measure. That's what made him so dangerous. People didn't fear him because he was cruel. They feared him because he was fair. After his death, those same people filled the streets during his funeral procession. Thousands lined the sidewalks. Women wept. Men removed their hats. Children stared in awe. Some mourned the man who had fed them, others the man who had ruled them. But all felt the void he left behind. The line of cars stretched for blocks, Cadillacs, Lincolns, black sedans with polished chrome and flowers piled high on their hoods. It looked less like a funeral and more like a coronation. Even in death, Frankie was still the king of Brooklyn. Yet behind the pageantry, there was unease. The people knew what his death meant. When men like Yale died, they didn't take peace with them. They took balance. He had been the weight that kept the scales from tipping too far in any direction. With him gone, the streets would fracture again. The wolves he'd kept on leashes would turn on each other. And they were right. Within months, Brooklyn descended into a quiet war. Small crews fighting for control of his territories. Men dying in alleys over nickels and pride. The order Frankie had built began to unravel, and with it, the illusion of safety he had sold so well. In Chicago, Capone sent flowers. Dozens of them. Orchids, lilies, wreaths, enough to fill half the funeral parlor. It was a strange gesture, part tribute, part confession. Some said Capone felt genuine sorrow. Others said it was guilt disguised as grief. But those who really knew understood what it meant. In their world, flowers weren't apologies. They were signatures. The deal was done. The blood had been paid for, the account settled. Capone never spoke of Yale again, at least not in public. But those who worked close to him said there were nights when the music stopped, and he'd go quiet, staring into nothing for a long time, like a man haunted by a memory he couldn't bury. Back in Brooklyn, Maria tried to keep the funeral home running for a while, but it was never the same. The men who used to come with envelopes and smiles stopped showing up. The cops who once tipped their hats at her door now walked by without looking. Within a year, she sold the business and moved away. The building changed hands several times before becoming just another storefront, its history erased by time. But sometimes old-timers would stop on the sidewalk and point at it, telling younger men, "That used to be Frankie Yale's place." They'd say it quietly, like they were speaking a prayer. For the men who'd worked under him, his death was more than the loss of a boss. It was the loss of an idea. Frankie had made crime feel elegant, even noble in a twisted way. He believed in discipline, in keeping the business part business and leaving emotion out of it. After him, the new generation didn't care about that. They wanted speed, noise, spectacle. They didn't build empires, they burned them. The codes he'd lived by, respect, restraint, silence, were relics. The world was changing, and Frankie Yale was one of the last of his kind. In the years that followed, legends grew around him. Some said he left behind hidden cash buried in walls or secret ledgers detailing every corrupt politician in New York. Others claimed he'd kept a black book with Capone's secrets and that it disappeared the day he died. None of it was ever proven. But that was the thing about men like Yale. The myths were often more real than the facts. They became part of the city's folklore, whispered in bars long after the last witness had died. There's a story that, years later, one of his old lieutenants visited his grave on the anniversary of his death. He brought a single rose, placed it on the stone, and said, "You were the best of us, boss. You just forgot what we are." The man walked away, leaving the flower to wilt in the sun. Maybe that was the truth of Frankie's life, that he spent so long trying to be both good and bad, human and untouchable, that he forgot which one he really was. In the end, the two worlds he'd balanced for so long, the family and the business, the church and the street, collapsed into one. There was no difference between them. Every prayer he'd whispered had been answered with a bullet. Every kindness had come wrapped in fear. But even knowing that, it's hard not to see a strange kind of poetry in his story. He lived exactly the way he wanted to, with grace, precision, and control. And when his time came, he met it the same way. Eyes forward, no panic, no pleading. The city changed after him. The old Brooklyn he'd ruled with his quiet authority disappeared, replaced by a harder, colder version. The men who came after were louder, cruder, greedier. They made headlines. Frankie made history. That's the difference between noise and legacy. And somewhere, in the collective memory of those who still whisper about the Underworld's golden age, Frankie Yale remains suspended between myth and man. The immigrant boy who learned that fear was power. The mentor who created a monster in Chicago. The gentleman gangster who could wear a tuxedo and carry a gun in the same pocket. A man who believed he could live in two worlds forever, only to learn, too late, that no one can. In the end, maybe that's why his story still lingers, because Frankie Yale wasn't just a criminal. He was a reflection of the world that made him, a world that promised success to anyone clever enough to take it, but punished those who reached too high, a world where power was both poison and cure. And as the years faded and his name slipped from the front pages into whispers, one truth remained unshaken. Frankie Yale lived by silence, ruled by loyalty, and died by the same code he'd created. He was both the funeral and the feast, both the priest and the sinner, both the law and its undoing. A man of two worlds, until those worlds finally collided and left nothing behind but echoes of jazz, gunfire, and the faint scent of roses drifting through the streets of Brooklyn. Chapter 10. The Capone Connection Turns Cold. There's a point in every empire where loyalty becomes a ghost, where friendship turns into silence, and silence becomes the language of betrayal. For Frankie Yale, that moment came slowly, like a chill creeping through an open window he forgot to close. It didn't arrive with a shout or a shot, not first. It came with small absences, a letter unanswered, a payment late, a message shorter than usual. The connection that had once been forged between Brooklyn and Chicago, between mentor and student, was beginning to fade. And in the world they lived in, fading wasn't something you could survive. For nearly a decade, Yale and Capone had built a bridge of business that stretched across the country. From Brooklyn's docks to Chicago's speakeasies, money and liquor flowed like blood through veins. They trusted each other because they'd built each other. Frankie had taught Al how to control a room with a smile, how to make a killing without pulling a trigger, how to use kindness as camouflage. Al had turned those lessons into an empire, one that made him untouchable. But as Capone's power grew, so did his paranoia. The man who once called Yale boss started to see shadows everywhere, even where there were none. It began with missing shipments. A few barrels here, a few crates there. Nothing major, nothing that couldn't be explained away. But small cracks always grow. Capone's men started keeping track, and before long, the numbers told a story, one that ended in betrayal. At least, that's how Capone saw it. He sent word east, subtle at first, a question hidden inside a compliment. "Frankie," he said through a messenger, "the boys say a few of your deliveries came up light. Probably nothing. You know how it is. But maybe keep an eye out." Frankie read the message twice and laughed quietly. "Tell him I'll count the barrels myself next time." He didn't take it seriously. He should have. By then, Capone had become something else. Not the ambitious kid from Coney Island, but a man who ruled through fear. He no longer trusted smiles. Every ally looked like a liability. The closer you were to him, the closer you were to danger. Frankie knew that type of man. He'd trained that type of man. What he hadn't realized was that he had trained Al Capone to outgrow him. Power changes people. It doesn't corrupt them suddenly. It erodes them, grain by grain, until all that's left is the hunger that built them in the first place. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Yale was still the gentleman gangster, calm, charming, untouchable. But the city around him was shifting. The younger generation of mobsters no longer played by his rules. They didn't care about style or subtlety. They wanted headlines, fast money, loud guns. The very kind of gangster Frankie had taught Capone not to be was now the only kind that survived. He tried to keep the peace, but the game was changing. And men who refused to change, no matter how powerful, always get swept away. The first sign that the connection was truly dying came when one of Capone's shipments went missing in transit. It was worth thousands, a fortune in liquor and reputation. The word from Chicago was simple. Brooklyn dropped the ball. Frankie called his contact in Chicago, a man named O'Donnell, who handled logistics for Capone's routes. "You think I'm stealing?" Frankie asked quietly. O'Donnell stammered. "Not me, Mr. Yale. Not saying that. Just the boss is asking questions." Frankie's voice stayed level. "Tell your boss he doesn't need to ask questions. He knows who I am." Then he hung up. It was a proud move, maybe too proud. In their world, pride was just another word for weakness that hadn't been tested yet. A few weeks later, another problem surfaced, this one bloodier. A Chicago enforcer who'd come east to check on operations was found dead in a Brooklyn alley. Nobody claimed responsibility, and nobody asked too many questions. But the message was unmistakable. Lines were being drawn. Capone's men suspected Yale. Yale suspected Chicago. Both were too proud to admit they were afraid of each other. The truth was simpler. They had both become too big for the same story. At the Harvard Inn, Frankie kept up appearances. He still greeted patrons with that quiet charm, still handed out drinks, still moved through his bar like a man untouched by time. But behind the polished veneer, he was tightening the screws, rotating his guards, changing routes, inspecting his own shipments. He trusted no one completely, not anymore. Late at night, he'd sit in his office, smoking in the dark, going over ledgers and maps. The numbers told him what the streets couldn't, that something was missing, something important, something dangerous. And yet, a part of him couldn't believe it. Not Al. Not the boy he'd taught to keep his cool when the world was on fire. Frankie wanted to believe that the bond between them was too strong to break. But deep down, he knew better. Bonds like that didn't survive the kind of power they both had. They only lasted as long as they were useful. And lately, neither man had much use for the other. In Chicago, Capone's paranoia had become legend. He had his own men searched before meetings, had his food tasted before every meal, slept in different rooms every night. To him, betrayal was as inevitable as sunrise. His empire was built on fear, and fear doesn't trust anyone. He began to see ghosts in every corner, and one of those ghosts had a Brooklyn accent. Still, the final break didn't come from an argument or a confession. It came, as it always did in their world, from money. A deal went bad. A shipment Yale had arranged through the docks vanished without explanation. The value was enormous. Capone demanded answers. Frankie sent word that he'd handle it personally. For weeks, they went back and forth through messengers, each letter colder than the last. Finally, Capone stopped writing. Silence again. The same silence that had always meant death in their line of work. Around that time, Frankie's men began to notice strangers in Brooklyn. Outsiders, dressed like businessmen, driving cars with Illinois plates. They asked questions they shouldn't have known to ask. They lingered too long in bars where they didn't belong. Yale knew what they were. Chicago eyes. Capone's way of saying, "I'm watching." Frankie didn't react. He never did. But inside, the clock had started ticking. The tension spread through his ranks like infection. His lieutenants grew restless. Some wanted to strike first, to send a message to Capone that Brooklyn still had teeth. Others wanted to cut ties completely. Frankie listened to them all, then said, "We don't start wars we can't finish." But his men could hear it in his voice. The calm was thinning. The man who'd once seemed unshakable now had shadows under his eyes. One evening, he went to church alone. It was late, the pews empty, candles flickering against the stained glass. He sat there for nearly an hour, hands folded, eyes closed. Whether he prayed or just sat in silence, no one knew. When he finally stood, he looked older, heavier. Outside, one of his drivers waited by the car. "Rough night, boss?" the man asked. Frankie exhaled smoke into the cold air and said quietly, just thinking about what happens when good teachers outlive their lessons. The driver didn't understand, and Frankie didn't explain. The next few weeks were chaos. Hijackings increased. 2 of Yale's top men disappeared. Police raids hit 3 of his warehouses, all tipped off by anonymous calls. The precision that had defined his empire was unraveling. And in the middle of it all, another message arrived from Chicago, this time, not in words but in blood. A mutual contact, a broker who'd worked for both men, was found shot in his car outside Joliet. A single bullet in the head, the kind of execution that said, "This conversation is over." That was when Frankie finally understood. There would be no fixing it. The bridge between Brooklyn and Chicago was gone, replaced by open road and open crosshairs. Still, he refused to run. To him, leaving would have been worse than dying. He'd built his life on pride, and if it was going to end, he'd end it on his feet. But he wasn't naive. He knew the rules. When the student turns on the teacher, the lesson is always the same. No one is untouchable. He began to notice things he'd once ignored. The way cars lingered too long near his house. The phone calls that went silent when he answered. The strangers at the bar who avoided his eyes. Each one a warning. Each one another nail in a coffin he was already building. And yet, he kept moving. He kept working. He kept being Frankie Yale. That was his curse. Even when the end was staring him in the face, he couldn't stop being who he was. In June, he threw a party at the Harvard Inn, his last big celebration. The place was packed. Music blared, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air. Frankie moved through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, joking like old times. But those who knew him best said there was something hollow in his smile that night. When a band played their final song, he stood near the bar, looking out at the people he'd ruled for so long. "To Brooklyn," he said softly, raising his glass. No one knew it was a goodbye. A week later, he was dead. They said the order came directly from Capone. No negotiation, no warning, no forgiveness. The killers drove from Chicago to New York, 3 men with Tommy guns and orders to finish what had already begun. They waited until the perfect moment, broad daylight, crowded streets. It wasn't just murder, it was theater. The message was meant to echo from one coast to the other. Even kings fall. When the news reached Chicago, Capone said nothing. He poured himself a drink, sat back, and stared into it for a long time. No toast, no smile. Just silence. Maybe he felt nothing. Maybe he felt everything. No one would ever know. Frankie had taught him that silence was power, and Capone had learned that lesson well. Back in Brooklyn, the streets mourned quietly. The newspapers called it revenge. The police called it justice. The people called it tragedy. But those who had lived under Yale's rule called it something else. The end of an era. The man who had once balanced crime with civility, who made murder feel like business, was gone. The rules were gone with him. The new world didn't care for gentlemen. It only cared for survivors. And so the connection that had once been built on trust, respect, and shared ambition ended in gunfire and shattered glass. The bridge between teacher and student had burned completely, leaving only smoke where loyalty once lived. Frankie Yale had built Al Capone, taught him how to rise, how to rule, how to keep the world beneath his feet. But he'd also taught him something else, that in their world, even gratitude had an expiration date. When the last of the funeral flowers wilted, Brooklyn moved on. The bars stayed open, the ships kept docking, the money kept flowing. But something invisible had died with Frankie. The idea that power could be quiet, that crime could have manners, that loyalty could outlast greed. Those things vanished the day the student pulled the trigger on the man who showed him where to aim. And so it was that the bond between Brooklyn and Chicago, once the strongest in the underworld, turned cold forever. Not because of greed or vengeance, but because the very thing that connected them had always carried its own poison. Frankie Yale had created a reflection of himself in Al Capone. And reflections, by nature, can't exist without the light that creates them. When that light fades, the reflection disappears, and all that's left is shadow. The business had always been about profit, but by the end, it was about survival. Capone survived. Yale did not. But maybe in some dark corner of his mind, Capone understood what that meant. That to survive, he had to destroy the part of himself that remembered who taught him how. And in that truth lies the coldest connection of all. Not between teacher and student, not between Brooklyn and Chicago, but between power and death. One never exists without the other. That was the last lesson Frankie Yale ever gave. And it was the one Al Capone would never forget. Chapter 11. The Brooklyn Beer Wars. By the time the calendar turned to 1925, Brooklyn was a city divided by money, alcohol, and bullets. The Prohibition dream had started as a crusade to cleanse the soul of America, but in Frankie Yale streets, it had done the opposite. It had made sin a business and murder an investment. The breweries that had once made honest beer now ran in the shadows, guarded by men with machine guns instead of accountants. The police couldn't stop it. The government couldn't control it. Only men like Frankie could decide who lived, who thrived, and who disappeared. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars, but it wasn't a war in the sense the public understood. It wasn't armies and flags. It was trucks hijacked in the night, bodies found in alleys, and entire fortunes decided by a single phone call that began with "he's not paying." For Frankie, beer wasn't just a product. It was power in liquid form. The breweries dotted across Brooklyn and Queens were the veins of his empire. Each one fed into his system of bars, clubs, and speakeasies. He didn't need to fight for control in the beginning. His reputation was enough. He was the gentleman gangster, the silent enforcer who preferred a handshake to a shootout. But as his influence grew, so did the number of men who wanted what he had. By 1925, the peace that had once defined Yale's reign was cracking. Rivals were testing him. New players, younger, hungrier, more reckless, were moving in. They didn't respect the old codes of loyalty. They respected only speed and violence. The first real spark came from Joe Masuria, the boss, a man who believed every racket in New York should answer to him. Masuria had tolerated Yale's independence for years, but tolerance was never his strong suit. He sent word through intermediaries, asking Yale to join his fold, to unify the business. It was less an invitation and more a warning wrapped in civility. Frankie ignored it at first. He had no interest in bowing to another man. But Brooklyn wasn't isolated anymore. The beer routes crossed into Manhattan territory, and the moment barrels crossed bridges, they carried war with them. When the first of Yale's trucks was hijacked, he didn't react publicly. The men who worked for him expected revenge. Instead, Frankie told them, "We don't respond with noise. We respond with silence that keeps people awake at night." He began quietly cutting off supplies to bars that had shifted allegiance. One by one, the establishments loyal to Masuria found themselves running dry. Customers got restless. Money stopped moving. And that, in Frankie's world, was louder than gunfire. But Masuria didn't back down. He was old school, brutal, superstitious, and unforgiving. He sent his men to strong-arm Yale's distributors, to smash bottles, torch warehouses, make examples. The streets began to smell like beer and blood. Frankie's calm demeanor never cracked, but those close to him could see the change. His movements became more precise, his circle smaller. He held meetings late into the night in the back of his funeral parlor, maps spread across tables, cigarette smoke swirling like fog around his head. Every street, every alley, every brewery became part of a larger game. He refused to play it Missouri's way. Frankie believed wars could be won with logic, not chaos. When Missouri's men raided one of his breweries, Yale didn't retaliate directly. Instead, he bribed the owner of a rival brewery under Missouri's control, offering him twice the profit to switch sides. Within a month, half of Missouri's supply chain had dried up, not from bullets, but from business. That was Frankie's style, to make you lose everything without ever realizing he'd move against you. But the younger gangsters, men like Vincent Mangano and Albert Anastasia, didn't believe in patience. They wanted action, blood, headlines. They began to stage their own hits, using Yale's name as cover. Frankie found himself dragged into skirmishes he hadn't ordered. His reputation as the calm mastermind began to blur. To the public, he was still the sophisticated outlaw. To the underworld, he was becoming something else, a man surrounded by noise he couldn't silence. One summer night, a group of gunmen ambushed one of Yale's beer trucks near Flatbush Avenue. The driver and his assistant were riddled with bullets. The barrels were stolen. The next day, another of Yale's men was found floating in the East River, his hands tied, a single bullet through his skull. The message was clear. The war was no longer about territory. It was about humiliation. Yale's power depended on perception, and perception was slipping. He called a meeting at his bar. Every lieutenant, every trusted ally showed up. The room was heavy with tension. Frankie stood at the center, his voice low, measured. "They want chaos," he said. "They want us loud, sloppy, stupid. But we don't fight like animals. We don't fight to make noise. We fight to remind them who built this city." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Brooklyn is mine. Anyone who forgets that will meet God through one of my doors." There was no cheering, no shouting, just quiet nods, and the understanding that the calmest man in the room was also the most dangerous. The next weeks were like chess, subtle moves, small victories. Yale's men began reclaiming routes, eliminating rivals quietly. There were no messy scenes, no witnesses. One by one, the problems disappeared. Missouri noticed. He sent word again, offering a truce. Frankie didn't respond directly. Instead, he sent him a gift, a crate of whiskey with a note inside. To the man who thought silence meant surrender. It was a warning disguised as humor. Missouri understood the message perfectly, but peace didn't last. It never did. Prohibition had created too much wealth for too many men to share. The federal raids were increasing, the pressure mounting. Every time one operation was shut down, two more opened in its place. And in that chaos, the line between friend and enemy blurred. Some of Yale's own men began cutting side deals, selling beer from rival suppliers, pocketing profits. When he found out, Frankie didn't raise his voice. He invited the guilty men to dinner, poured them wine, asked about their families. When dessert came, he excused himself to the kitchen. Moments later, the room exploded in gunfire. The message spread fast. Betrayal might make you rich for a night, but loyalty could keep you alive for years. Still, even Frankie couldn't control everything. The constant fighting was wearing him down. His days began to follow a rhythm of exhaustion. Meetings, negotiations, funerals, endless calculations. He had become both businessman and undertaker, profit and death rolled into one. Every dollar he made came with another life lost. The irony wasn't lost on him. He sometimes joked to his associates, "We sell the drink that kills the soul, and when it's done, I sell the coffin that hides the evidence." But beneath the humor was something darker: fatigue, regret, a faint realization that he was watching his own empire cannibalize itself. By 1927, the war had spread beyond Brooklyn. Queens, Manhattan, even the Bronx were now battlegrounds. Trucks exploded on highways. Speakeasies were raided by rivals posing as police. Bodies piled up faster than the newspapers could print names. The beer wars had become more than business. It was survival of the last man standing. And though Frankie still stood, he knew the ground beneath him was cracking. He tried to steady it. He met with other bosses, proposed alliances, deals, truces. He promised stability, structure, control. Some listened. Others smiled and lied. Everyone wanted what he had, but no one wanted to follow his rules. The new generation didn't believe in restraint. They didn't want peace. They wanted fame, like Capone had in Chicago, to be known, feared, photographed. Frankie watched it unfold like a man seeing the future he'd built twisted into something monstrous. One evening, after a particularly bloody week, he sat in his office at the funeral parlor, the lights low, the smell of lilies thick in the air. A shipment had gone missing. 3 of his men were dead. Another had been arrested. He poured himself a drink and stared at the framed photo on his desk, his wife and daughters smiling in the sun, untouched by the world that was consuming him. He wondered what they'd think if they knew what kind of man he'd become. Or maybe they already did. Maybe that's why they'd stopped asking where he went at night. Outside, thunder rumbled over the city. It wasn't weather. It was Brooklyn, alive and angry, guns echoing in the distance. Frankie leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Enough." But even as he said it, he knew there was no end. The machine he'd built didn't stop. It just kept feeding, demanding more beer, more money, more bodies. In the final months of the beer wars, the line between business and survival vanished completely. Men switched sides by the week. Allies killed each other over contracts. The city's morgues overflowed. And yet, through it all, Yale stayed the same on the surface, impeccably dressed, polite, calm. The papers still called him the gentleman of gangland. But his eyes told the truth. They had the look of a man who'd been at the top for too long, who knew that every empire, no matter how solid, eventually rots from the inside. Then came the message from Chicago. A shipment lost. Money missing. Suspicion renewed. The old wound reopened, and this time, there would be no bandage. Capone's men were whispering again, and the whispers carried weight. Yale knew it. The student was ready to erase the teacher. Still, Frankie refused to run. He'd lived through wars before. Street wars, family wars, now beer wars. Each one had taken something from him, but each one had left him standing. He told himself this one would be no different. But deep down, he could feel it. The shift, the inevitability. The storm he'd outrun for years was finally finding its way home. The beer wars would end, but not with victory. They'd end the way all things in his world did, with silence. The last gunfight, the last drive, the last lesson. And as the city's lights flickered across the black surface of the East River, reflecting the world he had built and destroyed in equal measure, Frankie Yale, the man who turned crime into business and murder into negotiation, stood on the edge of his empire, watching it crumble beneath the weight of its own greed. The wars had made him rich. They had made him feared. But they had also made him forget the one truth he'd always known. Power built on blood never dries. It just stains deeper. And as the smoke of Brooklyn's beer wars settled into the night, that stain was spreading, slowly, quietly, consuming everything he had ever touched. Chapter 12. Assassination of Arnold Rothstein. The night Arnold Rothstein died, New York lost more than just a gambler. It lost the man who had turned crime into commerce. The newspapers called him the brain, the architect of the modern underworld. To the public, his death was a mystery soaked in scandal. To the men who ruled the streets, it was a warning written in blood. For Frankie Yale, it was something else entirely, a shift in the balance of power that rippled through every alley and speakeasy from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Because when a man like Rothstein fell, the world didn't just react. It rearranged itself. It was early November of 1928 when the call came through. A shooting at the Park Central Hotel. Arnold Rothstein, the gambler who'd once fixed the World Series, lay dying from a bullet to the gut. The police called it a gambling dispute, but everyone knew that explanation was just a curtain. No one in New York believed a man like Rothstein, meticulous, cautious, calculating, would die over a poker game gone wrong. There was something bigger, something deeper, and behind closed doors, the name whispered most often wasn't the shooter's. It was Frankie Yale's. Frankie didn't pull the trigger. He wasn't even near Manhattan that night, but his name had weight, enough to carry suspicion without evidence. The rumor spread like wildfire. Some said Rothstein had crossed Yale in a bootlegging deal. Others claimed Yale had acted as a middleman in a feud that went sideways. The truth was murky, like everything in their world, but one fact was undeniable. The death of Arnold Rothstein marked the end of an era. The old-school businessmen of crime were being replaced by wolves. And Frankie Yale, whether he wanted to or not, was standing in the middle of that transformation. Rothstein's death hit the underworld like a thunderclap. For years, he had been the quiet force that kept chaos from spilling over. He loaned money to gangsters and politicians alike. He connected gamblers, bootleggers, and racketeers through webs of deals that no one else could untangle. He was the one who believed crime could be run like a corporation. In a way, Frankie was his reflection across the river. Both men believed in order, in intelligence over intimidation. They shared the same philosophy. Violence was only good when it served profit. But when Rothstein died, that philosophy went with him. The city erupted. Without Rothstein's steady hand, alliances shattered. Men who had been partners became enemies overnight. Yale watched it unfold from Brooklyn, calm on the surface, but he could feel the tremor building under his feet. He had seen this before, the moment when logic loses to chaos, when ambition outgrows control. His empire was strong, his men loyal, but the system that surrounded him was starting to rot. The new generation didn't care about balance. They wanted everything, and they wanted it now. In the days after Rothstein's assassination, police flooded the streets. They raided clubs, questioned mobsters, dragged in anyone with a known connection to the dead man. Frankie's name came up during the investigations, whispered by informants looking to save themselves. Maybe Yale was involved, one said. He had reason. Rothstein owed him money. It wasn't true, but truth didn't matter anymore. Once the idea existed, it lived on its own. The detectives who hated him, the papers that loved scandal, they all latched onto it. Frankie didn't flinch. He had been accused of worse. He knew the police had nothing but gossip, and gossip was currency in short supply. When a reporter cornered him outside his funeral parlor and asked if he'd known Rothstein, Yale adjusted his cufflinks and said, "A man like that doesn't die because of people like me. He dies because of the company he keeps." It was the kind of answer that revealed nothing, but sounded like everything. The journalist printed it word for word. But behind the smooth exterior, Frankie was studying the aftermath carefully. Rothstein's death left a vacuum, and nature, especially criminal nature, hates a vacuum. Every gang in the city was moving in, trying to seize a piece of what Rothstein left behind. His gambling dens, his connections, his debts. And in those debts lay both opportunity and danger. Some of Rothstein's clients owed large sums. Others owed favors. Frankie saw both as valuable. He began collecting, not in cash but in loyalty. Men who'd once belonged to Rothstein's orbit now found themselves under Yale's influence. He offered protection, money, stability. In return, they gave him access, new contacts, new channels, new power. But power always comes with noise. The moment Yale started to expand beyond Brooklyn, he began to bump against the interests of men who thought of Manhattan as their own kingdom. Joe Masuria was one of them, still clinging to his boss of bosses title, still demanding tribute. He saw Yale's moves as a challenge, an act of quiet rebellion. There were meetings, tense, smoke-filled, polite on the surface but deadly beneath. Yale kept his composure, smiling, offering reassurances. He didn't want a war, not now, not when the city was already bleeding. But Masuria didn't believe in peace. He believed in dominance. Rumors started again. This time, they weren't about Rothstein's murder. They were about the next one. The whispers claimed Masuria was planning to eliminate Yale, to take over his breweries and docks. It was hard to know what was true. The air was thick with lies, and every lie sounded like a warning. Frankie had lived long enough to know that paranoia wasn't weakness. It was survival. He doubled his guards, rotated his drivers, moved his meetings to unpredictable locations. But no matter how careful he was, he could feel the walls closing in. At the same time, Chicago kept calling. Capone's empire was growing larger and louder. The money was astronomical, but so was the risk. Capone's operations depended on New York liquor, and Yale's routes were the lifeline. Yet their partnership had soured. The trust was gone. Each saw the other as a liability. When Capone's men asked about Rothstein, about whether Yale had played a part, the question wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. In their world, suspicion was just a slower kind of death. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside his office, Frankie sat across from one of his oldest associates, a man named DeMarco. The radio in the corner played a soft jazz tune, the kind of music that made violence sound distant. DeMarco asked, "You think Rothstein's hit was a warning?" Frankie looked up slowly, his eyes half-shadowed. "Everything's a warning in this city," he said. "The trick is knowing which ones to listen to." DeMarco nodded, uneasy. "And which ones do we listen to now?" Frankie smiled faintly. "All of them." It was that kind of winter, a season of tension and coded messages, of alliances shifting like snowdrifts in the wind. Every day brought new rumors. Capone was sending killers east. Masuria was buying police. The Irish mobs were plotting revenge for debts left unpaid. Rothstein's ghost hovered over it all, not as a man, but as a symbol of how fragile power really was. By spring, the investigation into Rothstein's death had gone nowhere. The supposed shooter, a gambler named George "Hump" McManus, was acquitted. No one was punished. The case faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and new corpses. But in the underworld, it never ended. Rothstein's murder had become a parable. It was proof that no one, no matter how clever or connected, was immune. For Frankie, it was both a lesson and a mirror. He began noticing small things that unsettled him. His men looking over their shoulders, unfamiliar cars parked near his clubs, unfamiliar faces showing up at meetings. He'd lived through wars before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about legacy. The men coming up now didn't care about who came before them. They didn't believe in mentors or codes. They believed in headlines and speed. They were Capone's generation, loud, reckless, ruthless, and they were coming for everything. In quieter moments, Frankie would sit in his office, listening to the hum of the city outside. Sometimes he'd think about the early days, the Harvard Inn, the laughter, the feeling of control. Back then, crime had rules, even if they were written in blood. Now it was chaos pretending to be progress. The more he tried to hold on, the faster it slipped away. He had built his empire on discipline and respect. The New World didn't value either. One night, he found himself driving through Coney Island, past the place where it had all begun. The boardwalk was almost empty, the ride still, the sea dark and endless. He parked his car and stepped out, the cold air biting his face. For a long moment, he just stood there, listening to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. It felt like time itself had stopped, like the boy he once was and the man he had become were standing side by side, both wondering where it all went wrong. He thought about Rothstein again, about how quickly a man could go from untouchable to forgotten. "We're all the same in the end," he murmured to the wind, just waiting for a number. When he returned to his car, he noticed the headlights of another vehicle far down the road, idling. He didn't move right away. He lit a cigarette instead, taking a slow drag, eyes locked on the lights. They didn't move either. After a minute, the other car turned and disappeared into the night. Frankie exhaled smoke and whispered, "Not yet." Back in the city, the tensions that Rothstein's death had unleashed were reaching their peak. The beer wars were still raging, Masuria's ambitions were growing, and Capone's paranoia was spreading east like a fever. Frankie stood at the center of it all. the calm eye of a storm that was about to consume him. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was being watched by someone, somewhere, waiting for a mistake. The assassination of Arnold Rothstein hadn't just ended one man's life. It had signaled the death of a certain kind of gangster, the gentleman criminal, the businessman with boundaries. What replaced it was something colder, faster, meaner. Frankie Yale was one of the last of the old breed, and he knew it. That knowledge was both his pride and his doom. In the months to come, his name would surface again and again in connection with other killings, other deals, other betrayals. Each time, he'd deny involvement. Each time, he'd smile for the reporters and say, "I'm just a businessman." But the world no longer believed that. And deep down, neither did he. As spring turned to summer, the streets grew louder, meaner, more desperate. The line between friend and enemy blurred beyond recognition. And through it all, Frankie moved with that same quiet confidence, unaware, or maybe fully aware, that he was walking toward his final reckoning. Rothstein's fate had been the overture. His own was the symphony's last note. And somewhere, in the distance, the sound of another engine hummed. Faint, patient, inevitable. It was the rhythm of the world he'd built, coming back for its due. Chapter 13. The Last Job for Chicago. It began, as it always did, with a phone call that sounded too ordinary to matter. It was early June of 1928, and the sun had just begun to rise over Brooklyn, painting the city in pale gold. Frankie Yale sat in his office above the funeral parlor, the windows open, the faint scent of flowers mixing with the smoke of his cigarette. The phone rang once, then twice, before he picked it up. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, professional, a voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Yale," the man said, "Mr. Capone wants to thank you for your cooperation. There's one more shipment coming through. It's special. He wants you to handle it personally." Frankie didn't answer right away. He let the words hang in the air like dust. "Tell him," he said finally, "Brooklyn always takes care of business." He hung up, but the unease lingered. He couldn't place it exactly. The tone, the timing, something about the way the man spoke. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like an ending disguised as courtesy. By that summer, his empire was still vast, but the cracks were showing. The beer wars had drained the city of patience and profit alike. Every delivery now carried risk, from police raids, from rival gangs, from men who smiled in daylight and plotted in darkness. Frankie had built his reputation on control, on precision, but even he could feel that control slipping. His men were restless, his alliances brittle, and Chicago's patience, he knew, was long gone. Capone had stopped pretending. The friendship that had once been built on mutual respect had curdled into suspicion. Frankie could almost hear it in the silence between their words, like the hum of a wire waiting to snap. The shipment Capone mentioned was supposed to be routine, whiskey from the Midwest, arriving through the usual routes, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about it didn't sit right with Frankie. He had seen enough setups in his time to recognize the smell of one. Still, he couldn't refuse. Not Capone. Not after everything. A refusal would have been its own kind of death sentence. So he told his men to prepare. They'd escort the trucks, oversee the handoff, keep it clean. No mistakes, he said, and no heroes. In the days leading up to the shipment, Frankie moved through his routine with the quiet focus of a man trying to ignore the storm building around him. He met with suppliers, reviewed ledgers, attended a funeral for a man he'd never met. But the world felt different now, slower, heavier. The laughter in his clubs had lost its spark. The faces of his men seemed distant, distracted. He caught them exchanging glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Loyalty was slipping, the way it always does when fear enters the room. One night, he sat alone at the Harvard Inn, long after closing. The place was empty except for the ghosts. The smell of stale liquor and cigarette smoke clung to the air. He poured himself a drink, lit a cigarette, and stared at the reflection of the bar lights in his glass. The memory of Capone as a young man came back to him. The loud laugh, the scar that caught the light, the eagerness to prove himself. He could still hear the sound of that first brawl, the blood, the lesson he'd taught him afterward. You win by staying calm. And now, years later, that same lesson had become the weapon pointed back at him. Frankie had taught Capone everything he knew about patience, and now that patience had turned lethal. The day of the job was bright and uncomfortably warm. The kind of day where the air feels too still, too heavy, like the city itself is holding its breath. Frankie dressed with care, dark suit, polished shoes, his gold watch tucked beneath his cuff. He was meticulous about appearances, even when the world around him was falling apart. Before he left, he stopped by the funeral home's lower level, where the smell of flowers was strongest. He looked at the rows of caskets, gleaming under the dim light. Business is always good, he muttered to himself, half smiling, half tired. It was gallows humor, the kind only a man like him could afford. The plan was simple. He would drive to the rendezvous point, meet Capone's men, confirm the shipment, and oversee the transport back to Brooklyn. But deep down, he knew the plan wasn't simple at all. Nothing ever was. When he stepped into his Lincoln sedan, his driver glanced back nervously. "Everything all right, boss?" Frankie nodded. "Just another day at work." They drove in silence through the city streets. Brooklyn was alive as ever, vendors shouting, kids playing stickball, women gossiping from windowsills. Life went on, indifferent to the wars of men. Frankie watched it all pass by, the rhythm of the city he'd ruled for so long. He felt strangely detached, as if he were already watching from somewhere else, somewhere beyond the noise. The first sign of trouble came near the docks. One of his scouts, a young kid with sharp eyes, rode up on a motorcycle. "Something's off," he said breathlessly. "The trucks are late. No one's answering." Frankie didn't react. He just looked out toward the shimmering water. "Tell the boys to hold position," he said quietly. The kid hesitated. "What if it's a setup?" Frankie finally turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "Then we find out on our feet, not on our knees." They waited. Minutes passed. Then the sound of engines broke the stillness. 3 trucks approaching, headlights cutting through the dust. Everything looked normal at first. Too normal. As the first truck pulled up, Frankie stepped forward, adjusting his tie. The driver climbed out, hat low, face unreadable. "Yale?" he asked. Frankie nodded. "Who's asking?" The driver smiled faintly. "Just doing my job." It happened fast, too fast. The driver reached into his jacket, and for a split second, Frankie thought he was pulling out paperwork. Then came the flash. The sound of gunfire exploded through the docks, deafening and sharp. Men scattered, shouting, ducking behind crates. The trucks roared to life, speeding off as bullets tore through the air. Frankie dove behind his car, his driver already slumped over the wheel. The kid on the motorcycle was gone, vanished into the smoke or dead. Frankie couldn't tell. When the shooting stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. The air was thick with gunpowder and betrayal. Frankie stood slowly, dusting off his coat. He looked around at the chaos, the bodies, the blood, the overturned crates leaking whiskey onto the ground. The shipment was gone, and with it, his last chance at peace. He didn't call Capone. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The bridge was burned. There would be no more shipments, no more deals, no more loyalty. The job had been a setup from the start, a test, a trap, maybe even an execution that hadn't finished its work. For the first time in years, Frankie felt something close to fear. Not for his life. He'd made peace with that long ago, but for the truth. The student he'd once guided, the boy he'd protected and shaped, had turned into a man who saw loyalty as a weakness. That night, Frankie drove home alone. He didn't tell his men what happened. He didn't rage or curse or plan revenge. He just drove through the dark streets of Brooklyn, his city, his empire, now smaller than it had ever been. He parked outside his house and sat in the car for a long time, engine running, lights off. Through the window, he could see his wife moving about inside, unaware of the war that had just ended outside her door. He wanted to go in, to sit down, to tell her something, anything that would make sense of the life he'd built. But there were no words left. He shut off the engine, stepped out, and walked down the block instead. He ended up at a bar he used to visit in his younger days, before the power, before the suits, before the funerals. It was nearly empty now, just a bartender cleaning glasses and a couple of drunks mumbling into their drinks. Frankie sat at the far end and ordered whiskey. The bartender poured it without asking questions. Frankie raised the glass, studying the reflection of the amber liquid. "You ever think about how it ends?" he asked. The bartender shrugged. "It ends the same for everyone, doesn't it?" Frankie smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Some of us just take longer to realize it's already over." He finished his drink, paid in cash, and stepped back into the night. The air was cooler now, the city quieter. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. He lit a cigarette and started walking, his thoughts drifting between memory and regret. He thought about Capone, about how easily admiration had turned into rivalry, how the things that once bound them, ambition, discipline, pride, had become weapons. Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe it was the only way it could have gone. The next morning, he received another call. This time, it was short and simple. "Mr. Yale," the voice said, "the boss appreciates your help at the last job. There won't be any more." Frankie stared at the phone long after the line went dead. It wasn't a message. It was a verdict. Over the next few days, Frankie moved through his life as if nothing had changed. He still dressed impeccably, still visited his businesses, still smiled for the men who called him boss. But everyone around him could sense it. The shift, the calm before collapse. He was quieter now, almost peaceful. Some mistook it for confidence. Others, who knew better, recognized it as acceptance. On July 1st, 1928, the day began like any other. The sky was clear, the streets humming with the rhythm of summer. Frankie left his house in the early afternoon, tipping his hat to a neighbor as he got into his Lincoln. He had one errand to run, he told his wife. Just business. He promised to be home by dinner. She smiled, not knowing she'd never see him again. As his car rolled through the streets, the city seemed unusually still. The wind was soft, the light almost golden. He drove past the familiar landmarks of his empire, the bars, the warehouses, the corners that had built his legend. Every street held a memory, every turn a story. When he reached 65th Street, he slowed for a red light. A black sedan pulled up alongside him. Inside, 3 men waited, their eyes cold, their hands steady. The first burst of gunfire shattered the quiet afternoon. Windows exploded, tires screamed. The sound of the Thompson submachine gun echoed through Brooklyn. Sharp, relentless, final. Frankie's car swerved, slammed into a parked vehicle, and came to a stop. The other car sped away, leaving smoke in its wake. When the police arrived, they found Frankie Yale slumped over the wheel, his body riddled with bullets. His gold watch was still ticking. His face, even in death, looked calm, almost serene, as if he'd finally found the peace he'd spent his whole life pretending he already had. Later that evening, word spread like fire. The great Frankie Yale, mentor to Al Capone, king of Brooklyn, was gone. The city buzzed with disbelief. Some called it betrayal. Some called it justice. But those who truly understood the game called it what it was. The final business transaction between teacher and student. The last job for Chicago hadn't been a shipment. It had been him. And as the sun set over Brooklyn that night, the silence he had always valued most finally came for him. Cold, clean, and absolute. Chapter 14. The Death of a Gentleman Gangster. When the smoke cleared on that July afternoon in 1928, Brooklyn didn't realize it had just lost its last gentleman. The streets had seen plenty of gangsters, but none like Frankie Yale. His death didn't come with the chaos of sirens or the glory of resistance. It came quietly, precisely, almost respectfully, a punctuation mark at the end of a story that had been written in whispered deals and measured violence. When the news hit the papers that night, the city buzzed, the underworld held its breath, and those who had known him personally felt the same cold realization. The rules had changed forever. The era of polish and restraint had died with him. What came next would be louder, bloodier, and without grace. The car was still sitting where it had crashed, a twisted piece of elegance now riddled with holes. The Lincoln, once Yale's symbol of refinement, was shattered glass and bent steel. Stray dogs circled it, their paws splashing through the pools of gasoline and blood. A crowd had gathered, the curious mixing with the sorrowful, and somewhere among them, a few of Yale's men stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. To the world, Frankie Yale had been invincible, untouchable, the man who could turn a murder into a handshake. But in the end, he was as mortal as the rest. The police arrived late, as they always did when gangsters died. The detectives recognized the body immediately. One of them, a veteran of the Prohibition detail, muttered, "Brooklyn's gone quiet." Another simply said, "Capone." They didn't need evidence. The method spoke for itself. No one in New York had ever been taken out with a Thompson submachine gun before. It was the Chicago signature, loud, efficient, impersonal. Capone had brought his brand of justice across state lines. It was both a message and a promise. No one, not even the teacher, was above the lesson. News spread fast. Within hours, every newspaper in the city was screaming headlines about the assassination. Gang chief slain in auto battle, read one. Yale murdered in Chicago-style hit, said another. The reporters painted it like a scene from a movie. The speeding cars, the thunder of gunfire, the shattered glass raining over Brooklyn. They made it sound almost glamorous. But to those who had known Frankie, the reality was anything but. His death wasn't cinematic. It was surgical. It wasn't revenge. It was business. At his home, the news hit like a quiet explosion. His wife, Lucida, fainted when she heard. His daughters were rushed upstairs by neighbors, too young to understand why everyone was crying. The phone rang endlessly, calls from friends, enemies, and the press. Some offered condolences. Others asked questions they already knew the answers to. A few called only to confirm he was really gone. That was the thing about the Underworld. No one believed a man like Yale could die until they saw the body. The funeral preparations began immediately, and appropriately, they were grand. After all, death was one business Frankie understood better than anyone. His own funeral parlor, the same one that had seen countless other gangsters laid to rest, was now being dressed for him. Flowers arrived in endless waves. Roses, lilies, wreaths shaped like hearts, crosses, and crowns. Men who had once feared him sent their condolences wrapped in ribbon. Women who had danced with him sent letters they never dared to mail while he lived. The city turned out to see him one last time. Thousands lined the streets outside the parlor, waiting for a glimpse of the open casket. The crowd wasn't just made of gangsters and gamblers. There were bar owners, dock workers, even mothers holding children who'd never met him but knew his name. For years, Frankie had been part myth, part man, the figure who ruled with civility in a world that had none. And now, that civility was lying still in a coffin lined with silk. Inside, the room was quiet except for the soft sound of prayer. His body was dressed impeccably, black suit, polished shoes, the gold watch still on his wrist. The undertakers had done their work well. He looked peaceful, untouched by the violence that ended him. The bullet holes were hidden, the bruises gone. Only those who had seen the car knew the truth. To the rest, he looked like he had simply gone to sleep. Among the mourners stood men who had once shared his table, his business, his secrets. Joe Masuria came briefly, his expression unreadable. He placed a single white rose at the foot of the coffin and whispered something no one could hear. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps it was a promise. Other bosses followed, their presence both tribute and territory, a silent reminder that the game didn't stop for death. Capone sent flowers but no words. A massive arrangement of orchids arrived from Chicago, signed only a friend. Everyone understood what that meant. The priest spoke softly about redemption, about the soul finding peace, but in the crowd, few believed in that kind of salvation. Men like Yale didn't go to heaven or hell. They lived in a different purgatory, one of memory, myth, and consequence. When the ceremony ended, the pallbearers lifted the casket slowly, the weight heavier than any of them admitted. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions that no one answered, and the black cars lined up like soldiers. The procession stretched for blocks, a parade of grief and power. As the hearse rolled through Brooklyn, people stood on the sidewalks watching. Some crossed themselves. Others just stared. For years, he had been part of their city, the man who paid for local parades, who handed out cash to struggling families, who made sure trouble stayed out of certain neighborhoods. To them, he wasn't just a gangster. He was a protector, a necessary evil in a world full of worse ones. When his coffin passed, even those who'd cursed his name lowered their heads. The burial took place in St. John's Cemetery, the same ground that would one day hold so many of New York's underworld legends. The sun was bright, almost painfully so, as the coffin was lowered into the ground. A light breeze stirred the grass, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd faded. Someone said that as the first handful of dirt hit the casket, a bird took off from a nearby tree, circling once before disappearing into the blue. Some called it a sign. Others called it coincidence. Frankie would have called it timing. After the funeral, Brooklyn changed. The men who'd built their fortunes under Yale's guidance scattered. Some joined other families. Some went independent. A few disappeared entirely. The order he had enforced, the delicate balance between violence and restraint, began to crumble. Without him, there was no center, no calm. The wolves filled the void. Murders increased. Deals went sour. The city that had once run like clockwork under his invisible hand now spun wildly out of control. Capone's reaction, when the news reached him, was brief. They said he was sitting in his office, playing cards, when a messenger whispered in his ear. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, set his card down, and said, "Good. It's done." Then he poured himself a drink and stared at the glass for a long time. No one knew what he was thinking. Some said he looked sad. Others said he looked relieved. Maybe both were true. Capone had inherited not just Yale's routes and contacts, but also his ghost, the weight of having destroyed the one man who had once been like a father to him. Back in Brooklyn, the legends began almost immediately. Some said Yale had seen his death coming and accepted it like a man. Others whispered he had a chance to run, but refused. A king doesn't flee his own city, they said. His name lingered in the bars and backrooms, in the stories old gangsters told to young ones. He wasn't like the rest, they'd say. He had class. Even his enemies admitted it. Frankie Yale had lived and died by a code that no longer existed, a belief that there was honor, even in crime. The police, as expected, found nothing. No witnesses, no arrests, no justice. The killers had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, their mission completed with professional precision. Everyone knew it was Capone's men, but no one dared to prove it. The silence around Yale's death was the same silence he had built his career on. Dignified, dangerous, final. Weeks passed, then months. Life moved on. The world that had once revolved around Frankie shifted toward newer, louder figures. Capone became a national sensation. The newspapers turned their attention to Chicago. New York's gangs restructured under new bosses. But even as time rolled forward, Yale's presence lingered in the city's bones. The funeral home continued operating under a different name, but locals still called it Yale's Place. His old bar stayed open for years, the same piano, the same smell of whiskey and ambition. It was said that sometimes, late at night, the lights would flicker on for no reason, as if the past itself refused to stay buried. For his family, the loss was quieter but heavier. His wife moved away. His daughters grew up hearing half-truths and legends about the father who'd built an empire and lost it to betrayal. The money dwindled, the friends vanished, the name became a shadow. That was the cruel truth of their world. Loyalty ended at the grave. But among the old-timers, those who remembered the days before Capone, before chaos, Frankie Yale's name carried a strange kind of reverence. He wasn't worshipped, but he was remembered as the bridge between two worlds, the man who had tried to make crime civil, who believed respect could coexist with ruthlessness. His death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an idea. Years later, historians would write about him in measured tones. They'd call him a pioneer of organized crime, a man who professionalized the underworld before the Mafia became a household word. They'd note his contradictions: the killer who loved fine suits, the extortionist who donated to churches, the smuggler who hated chaos. But for those who'd stood beside him, the truth was simpler. He was Frankie Yale, the man who kept his word and expected others to do the same. And when they didn't, he handled it, cleanly, quietly, without spectacle. As time went on, his story faded into myth. The newer generations of gangsters, men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, would study what he built and what he lost. They'd learn from his mistakes, use his death as a blueprint for survival. And in that way, he lived on, not as a ghost, but as a lesson carved into the foundation of the modern Mafia. But for those who still whispered his name in the bars of Brooklyn, he remained something else: the gentleman gangster. The one who could order a hit in the same tone another man ordered dinner. The one who ruled without shouting. The one who knew that silence wasn't weakness, it was power disguised as grace. On the anniversary of his death, a few old men still came to his grave, leaving cigars and roses. They said it was for luck, or respect, or memory. Maybe all three. The grass around his headstone stayed well kept, the letters of his name still sharp against the stone. And though the city had changed, the streets noisier, the men rougher, the rules forgotten, that small piece of ground remained a reminder of a time when crime had manners and power had polish. Frankie Yale's death was more than an ending. It was a turning point, a line drawn between what the underworld had been and what it was about to become. The men who followed him would build empires bigger than his, but none would do it with his quiet dignity. They would rise faster, fall harder, die younger. The brutality that replaced him was louder, but never smarter. And so the story of Frankie Yale closed the only way it could, not with chaos, but with calm. A man born in the noise of Brooklyn's docks, who climbed through blood and whiskey to rule an empire, ended as he lived, composed, deliberate, and surrounded by silence. Even death, it seemed, had shown him respect. The papers called him a criminal. The city called him a king. But history would remember him as something far more rare, a man who brought order to disorder, who turned the racket of the streets into something almost elegant. The last gentleman in a world that no longer had use for gentlemen. And as the years rolled on, the echoes of his life faded into legend. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of deals, the low voice that commanded a city without ever raising it. Until all that was left was a single truth whispered among the old men in dark bars. Frankie Yale didn't just run Brooklyn. He defined it. And when he died, Brooklyn never sounded the same again. Chapter 15. The Shadow He Left Behind. For years after his death, Frankie Yale's shadow lingered in Brooklyn like cigarette smoke in a closed room. Faint, stubborn, impossible to ignore. It crept through alleys and backrooms, whispered in bars, and haunted the men who had once worked under him. His funeral might have buried the man, but not the legend. And in the world of organized crime, legends were more powerful than truth. They didn't fade. They infected. In the weeks following his assassination, Brooklyn was tense, quiet, like a city waiting for an aftershock. The air buzzed with rumors, whispers that Yale wasn't really dead, that he had faked his death to escape Capone's reach, that the coffin was empty. Others claimed his ghost had been seen outside his old bar, standing under the flickering light, coat collar up, watching the street as he used to. It didn't matter if people believed it or not. The myth kept him alive, and myths have their own kind of authority. The police, of course, had their version: dull, official, uninspired. They chalked it up to a Chicago-style mob hit and filed it away. But inside the underworld, the implications were enormous. Yale's assassination wasn't just the murder of a man. It was a message to every boss from New York to New Orleans. The age of diplomacy was over. The gentleman's code had been replaced by something new, a language written in gunfire. The lesson was clear. If a man like Frankie Yale could fall, anyone could. His men scattered. Some fled the city altogether. Others switched allegiances to Joe Masuria or Salvatore Maranzano, sensing which way the wind was blowing. A few tried to carry on his operations, but it was never the same. Without Yale's precision and discipline, the machine jammed. The routes broke down. The shipments vanished. The police raids became more frequent. Within months, his empire was reduced to fragments, broken pieces picked apart by the vultures of the underworld. And yet, even in death, Frankie still commanded respect. The new bosses spoke of him carefully, never mocking, never dismissive. They knew better. In the backrooms of Little Italy, in smoky speakeasies, his name was mentioned like an oath. Yale would have handled it different. They'd say when negotiations turned violent. Or, Yale never needed to shout. He became a measuring stick, the standard against which other gangsters were judged. And none of them measured up. One man in particular carried the weight of his ghost, Al Capone. Though he never admitted it publicly, those closest to him said Capone grew quieter after Yale's death. He drank more, slept less, and kept a photo of his old mentor in his Chicago office for years. Sometimes, when business was bad or the killings piled up too fast, he'd stare at the photo and mutter under his breath. He made it look easy. No one dared to ask what he meant. Some said he kept seeing Yale in his dreams. Not accusing, not forgiving, just staring at him across a table they could never leave. But Capone wasn't haunted out of guilt alone. He was haunted by realization. Yale had represented something Capone could never replicate: grace. The kind of quiet control that didn't need to be enforced by constant terror. Capone ruled through spectacle. Yale had ruled through presence. And now that presence was gone, the balance of power in America's underworld had shifted for good. Back in Brooklyn, the remnants of Yale's organization tried to rebuild. His lieutenant, Tony Carfano, better known as Little Augie Pisano, took over what was left of the operation. But Little Augie was a different breed. Flashier, louder, more violent. He lacked Yale's finesse, his ability to blend business and brutality. Under Augie's leadership, the operation became sloppy. Cops started cracking down harder. The money was still there, but the respect was gone. Old-timers watched the change with quiet disgust. They said the streets felt different now, colder, angrier. The bars were louder, the deals shorter, the funerals more frequent. Frankie would have never allowed this, one of them said, shaking his head over a drink. He kept order. Now it's just chaos wearing a suit. And they were right. The underworld Yale had built was gone, replaced by one that no longer cared about polish or propriety. It cared only about profit. The void left by Yale's death also changed the way New York's gangs operated. His assassination had shown everyone that geography no longer offered protection. Chicago could reach into Brooklyn. Brooklyn could reach into Manhattan. There were no borders anymore, only opportunities. That realization sparked a quiet arms race, one that would soon explode into full-blown war. Within 2 years, the Castellammarese War would tear through the city, pitting Masuria and Maranzano against each other in a bloody struggle for control. And in that chaos, Yale's name became a ghostly warning. Remember what happened to him, men whispered. Remember the price of being too proud. But outside the underworld, Frankie Yale's legend took a different shape. The public saw him as a paradox, a criminal who dressed like a banker, a killer who ran a funeral home, a man who brought flowers to his victims' widows. The papers loved the contradiction. They printed stories romanticizing his rise from a poor immigrant kid to a self-made king of Brooklyn. Some even painted him as a tragic figure, a man destroyed by his own ambition, betrayed by the world he helped create. The more they wrote, the larger he became. In the neighborhoods where he once walked, people told stories about him to their children. He looked after the people here, they said, kept the junkies away, made sure no one touched the women. It didn't matter if it was true. In communities where law meant nothing and survival meant everything, men like Yale became folk heroes, symbols of power that came from the streets, not City Hall. Still, for those who had truly known him, the myth was too clean, too kind. The real Frankie Yale was both better and worse than the legend allowed. He was ruthless when he needed to be, gentle when it suited him, unpredictable in ways that made men both fear and admire him. He could have someone killed in the morning and buy toys for his daughters in the afternoon. He wasn't a monster. He was something rarer, a man who understood both darkness and dignity, and how to wear them like a tailored suit. In time, his story became part of Mafia education, a cautionary tale whispered to young soldiers by their captains. "Don't forget Yale," they'd say. "He thought friendship meant loyalty. It doesn't. It means convenience." They studied his mistakes as much as his brilliance. His downfall taught them that no empire, no matter how carefully built, could survive when sentiment got in the way of strategy. And in that way, Yale's legacy became a blueprint, not for how to live, but for how not to die. But in the quiet corners of Brooklyn, the ghost remained. Every man who took a seat in the back of a car at night thought about him, just for a moment. Every time a boss trusted an ally too much, every time someone said, "It's just business," Frankie's story was there, hovering between the words. He had become more than a man. He was a warning carved into the DNA of organized crime. Decades later, when historians began to write the official story of the American Mafia, Yale was often mentioned only briefly, a stepping stone, a name before Capone's. But those who really understood the lineage knew better. Without Yale, there was no Capone. Without his structure, there was no modern organization. He was the bridge between the street gangs of the early 20th century and the syndicates that followed. The one who taught the next generation how to turn chaos into commerce, blood into business. Even the FBI files from that era, declassified years later, described him with an odd mix of admiration and fear. Yale operated with unusual discretion, one report read. He maintained respect among competitors and avoided unnecessary publicity. His control over Brooklyn was based on influence rather than intimidation, an uncommon trait among racketeers. In other words, he didn't just run a criminal empire. He ran a philosophy, and like all philosophies, his outlasted him. It seeped into the next wave of mobsters. Men like Luciano, Costello, Genovese, who took his quiet pragmatism and reshaped it into something colder, more efficient. They learned from him that violence was a tool, not a performance. They learned that the real power wasn't in the gun, but in the silence that followed its use. But even as his legacy evolved, the tragedy of Frankie Yale remained, the contradiction of a man who tried to bring civility to a savage business. He believed he could outthink the brutality, control it, refine it. In the end, it consumed him just the same. His elegance couldn't save him from the math of his world. One betrayal cancels one friendship. One mistake erases a lifetime of loyalty. One moment of trust ends everything. In a strange way, that was the beauty of his story. Not that he was defeated, but that he had existed at all. That for a brief moment in history, a man could make crime look graceful, could turn a funeral parlor into a front for an empire, and still carry himself like a gentleman. He was proof that even in darkness, there could be form, discipline, a kind of art. And when he died, that art died with him. Years later, when the old neighborhoods changed, when the speakeasies became apartments, when the docks went quiet, the name Frankie Yale still hung in the air like a perfume that refused to fade. The older men who had known him would tell stories over their last drinks, voices trembling with nostalgia. He wasn't like the ones today, they'd say. He had class. He had control. When he walked into a room, you felt it, like the air got heavier. And for a moment, their eyes would soften, remembering the calm in his voice, the sharpness of his suits, the confidence of a man who never needed to shout to be obeyed. In the end, that was his true legacy. Not the money, not the power, not even the fear. It was the silence he left behind. The kind that follows a great performance, when the crowd doesn't dare to clap just yet. The kind that makes men pause before they speak his name. Frankie Yale had lived by silence, and even in death, it obeyed him. The shadow he left behind wasn't just his own. It was a shadow over an entire generation of men who came after him, men who would never again see the kind of balance he brought to their world. They would be richer, louder, deadlier, but never as composed. His world had vanished, replaced by one that no longer understood the difference between power and noise. But in the corners of Brooklyn, under the streetlights where he once walked, you could still feel it, the faint echo of footsteps belonging to a man who ruled like a king and vanished like a ghost. And though the city moved on, though the faces changed and the wars raged on, one truth remained. Frankie Yale had been the last of his kind. The last man who made the underworld look like a gentleman's club instead of slaughterhouse. The last who could walk between death and dignity and never lose his balance. That's why his story still matters. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived, with quiet precision, unshakable pride, and a kind of grace that even bullets couldn't erase. In the end, his body may have fallen, but his shadow never did. It stretched on, over Brooklyn, over Chicago, over every man who ever thought he could control the darkness without being swallowed by it. And long after the last witness was gone, after the last speakeasy had closed, after even the name Yale had faded from the papers, the silence remained, deep, dignified, eternal. The silence of a man who once ruled the noise. Chapter 16. Echoes of Power. Time has a strange way of erasing faces, but keeping the outlines of power intact. Years passed, and yet in certain corners of Brooklyn, the name Frankie Yale was never truly gone. It lingered like the aftertaste of smoke in a bar long closed, or the faint vibration of a train that's already vanished into the tunnel. People didn't talk about him as much anymore, not out loud. But he was there, in the architecture of the city, in the way deals were made, in the quiet rituals of men who had learned from his blueprint, even if they pretended not to. Frankie had been gone for years, but the methods he pioneered, the rules he wrote, the poise he carried, they survived him. And in that survival lay the echo of something larger than one man's empire. By the early 1930s, Brooklyn had changed. The air felt heavier with money and menace. The Great Depression had thrown the country into desperation, but crime never went bankrupt. While honest men lined up for soup, gangsters lined up for opportunity. It was a new generation now, ruthless, practical, hungry. Men like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello were taking control. They spoke of efficiency, networks, systems, words Yale himself might have used if he'd lived long enough to see it. These were the men who transformed street crime into corporate crime. They called it organization. But deep beneath the polished meetings and boardroom metaphors was the foundation that Frankie had built brick by brick. He had shown them how to give chaos a dress code. In those years, whispers about Yale became myths. Some said he had foreseen this new world, that he knew it would happen. Others insisted his death had been the final necessary sacrifice to bring order to the American underworld. They made him sound like a prophet who had died before his religion could take form. The truth, as always, was murkier. Frankie hadn't sought to build an empire beyond his lifetime. He had simply wanted control over his own. But in achieving that, he had laid down the blueprint for a machine far bigger than himself. The very structure that would become the American Mafia owed more to his logic than most would ever admit. Old associates of Yale, those few who had survived the brutal shifts of power, spoke about him in hushed tones when they met in bars. They'd sit in the corners, sipping whiskey, reminiscing about the days when Brooklyn ran on silence instead of spectacle. One of them, an aging driver named Moretti, was known for repeating a single line whenever someone mentioned Capone. "I'll had guns," he'd say, tapping his glass on the table. Frankie had gravity. The others would nod in agreement. Gravity, that was the word. Yell and pull people toward him through fear. He drew them in through inevitability. You couldn't resist him, because resistance felt foolish. It was ironic, then, that the men who inherited his world misread his greatest lesson. They took his calm and mistook it for softness. They took his structure and used it for cruelty. The underworld became louder after him. Capone made noise. Luciano made systems. The next wave made chaos. And through it all, The quiet that had defined Frankie's reign grew rarer, like a language that fewer people could still speak. The new bosses ran their empires like factories, efficient, ruthless, faceless. They understood profit, but not grace. And maybe that was the price of progress. Every now and then, though, his name would surface. A detective retiring from the force might mention him in a barroom story. Yale, he'd say, staring into his beer. Now that was a gangster. Never needed the press. Never smiled for the camera. You didn't find him. He found you. Young reporters, chasing the next headline about crime syndicates, would look through the old case files and stumble across his name in dusty police reports, each one a reminder that modern crime didn't invent itself. And in Chicago, the veterans of Capone's old circle remembered too. They said I'll never spoke of the killing directly. If someone mentioned Yale, Capone would pause, his jaw tightening, then change the subject. There were rumors that near the end of his life, when syphilis began to eat away at his mind, Capone sometimes mumbled Yale's name in the dark. Frankie, he'd whisper. It was business, Frankie. Just business. But ghosts don't care for apologies. Frankie's ghost had long moved on, leaving only its outline behind, a way of thinking, a standard of power. The men who came after him carried pieces of him unknowingly. Luciano's diplomacy, Lansky's calm, Costello's refinement, all of it traced back to Yale. He had been the prototype of organized crime's future, the first to truly separate brutality from business, to see violence not as theater, but as management. He wasn't trying to make the world believe he was legitimate. He was trying to make the illegitimate world behave as though it was. Even the city itself seemed to remember him in subtle ways. The old funeral parlor that had once served as his office still stood, though it had changed owners and names many times. The marble steps had been worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and the brass doorknobs gleamed from countless hands. But if you looked closely, you could still see the faint outline of the letters where Yale Funeral Home had once been etched. It was like the city refused to erase him completely. Some nights, locals swore they could hear faint music from the Harvard Inn, even though it had been torn down years ago, an echo of laughter, clinking glasses, and a low murmur of men who thought they'd live forever. It wasn't just the streets that carried him forward. The idea of Frankie Yale, the businessman gangster, the calm boss, the paradox of ruthlessness and refinement, became part of American imagination. Hollywood took notice. Gangster films of the 30s and 40s borrowed pieces of him without naming him outright. The way Edward G. Robinson's characters adjusted their ties before ordering a hit. The way Humphrey Bogart's antiheroes used quiet instead of shouting. It was all Yale. He had become the archetype without ever intending to. Even in fiction, his ghost had influence. But real life had less romance. In the years following his death, law enforcement tightened its grip. The Prohibition era ended, and with it went the rivers of illegal liquor that had built so many fortunes. The mob evolved, turning toward gambling, unions, and narcotics. The sophistication Yale had embodied turned into bureaucracy. Crime became paperwork and meetings, decisions made in hotel rooms instead of bars. In that evolution, his shadow stretched even further. The more the underworld tried to organize itself, the more it resembled what he had always envisioned, a criminal corporation that mirrored legitimate business, complete with hierarchy, branding, and silence. Every few years, someone would rediscover him, a journalist, a historian, a writer. They'd dig through the archives, fascinated by the contrast between Yale and his successors. They'd note how he maintained order without spectacle, how he managed to keep his public image as a businessman while running one of the most powerful rackets in New York. They'd compare him to Capone, then inevitably conclude that while Capone was a storm, Yale had been the weather that made the storm possible. It wasn't as dramatic, but it was more enduring. In the underworld itself, his name became a kind of password, a reference point for a code that no longer existed. When a young mobster lost control or drew too much attention, an older one might shake his head and say, he should have studied Yale. It meant you'd forgotten the balance between power and performance. It meant you were playing the game wrong. Even as decades passed, Frankie's story kept surfacing in unexpected places. In the 1950s, an old associate of his published memoirs from prison, claiming Yale had once planned to retire, to move his operations into legitimate business entirely. He wanted out, the man wrote. He said, "You can't stay in the game forever. One day, the game decides it's done with you." It was a haunting line, one that echoed eerily with the way he died. Whether the story was true or not didn't matter. It felt true. It fit the man. But perhaps the most striking part of Yale's afterlife was how cleanly he disappeared from the larger story. When people talked about the great crime bosses of the early century, they mentioned Capone, Luciano, Lansky, but not Yale. He had become the invisible architect, the man who designed the foundations but never carved his name into the stone. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. His fingerprints were everywhere, invisible but undeniable. Every time a deal was made quietly instead of violently, every time a gang preferred subtlety over chaos, that was Frankie. Every time a man chose silence over boasting, discipline over fury, the echo of Yale was in that choice. His story also carried another kind of lesson, one less romantic. It was a reminder that even the most calculated man cannot escape the irrational heart of power. Frankie believed logic could control the world, but emotion, fear, jealousy, betrayal, had undone him. Capone's bullet wasn't fired by business. It was fired by insecurity. That's what makes his story tragic. He wasn't defeated by a rival empire. He was destroyed by the very human flaws he thought he'd outgrown. And yet, maybe that's why he remains compelling. He wasn't untouchable, not in the way legends pretend. He was mortal, contradictory, flawed, but aware. Deep down, he must have known how it would end. Maybe that's why he never left Brooklyn, why he never ran when the signs were clear. Men like him lived by control, and when that control slipped, they didn't run after it. They accepted the fall as part of the design. Years later, a younger gangster who'd never met him but worshipped his legend summed it up perfectly. Frankie didn't die scared. He died centered, like he already made peace with being history. That idea, dying centered, stuck, because even in death, Yale remained composed, untouched by panic or noise. His car riddled with bullets, his hand still clutching the wheel. It was almost poetic, like a man steering his own ending. The city around him changed beyond recognition. Skyscrapers rose where warehouses once stood. The docks emptied. The bars turned into apartments. But the ghost stayed. Old-timers sitting outside corner stores still remember the days when men like Yale ran the neighborhoods, when respect was as tangible as money, when silence meant power. They'd tell the young kids, back then, a handshake could save your life, or end it. And nobody shook hands like Frankie Yale. What none of them said, though, was that his story was also a warning to the powerful, inside and outside the mob. You can build an empire on rules. You can enforce discipline, you can surround yourself with loyalty, but you can't escape the echo of what you create. Frankie had built men like Capone, had shaped the very system that would one day erase him. The echo of power doesn't belong to the one who starts it. It belongs to those who learn how to amplify it. And that was the price he never calculated. In the end, perhaps that's the truest measure of a legacy, that it continues without needing the man who started it. Frankie's name faded, but his rhythm stayed. Every deal made in silence. Every boss who valued order over chaos. Every empire that balanced elegance with fear. They were all speaking his language, even if they didn't know it. His echo was in every decision that kept the underworld organized instead of burning itself alive. Late at night, in the still corners of Brooklyn, where the streetlights hum and the air smells faintly of rain and gasoline, you can almost hear it if you listen hard enough. The sound of a city breathing through its ghosts. The faint murmur of a man's voice, low, calm, unhurried, saying what he'd said 100 times before. Stay quiet. Stay smart. Stay in control. The advice that built empires, buried kings, and still echoes across time. The echo of Frankie Yale was not one of fear or violence, but of control, the kind of control that outlives its owner. And so his power, even in death, didn't vanish. It dispersed. It seeped into the city's veins, into the language of every man who ever tried to rule without shouting, into the silence that still lingers between gunshots and deals, between ambition and consequence. Frankie Yale may have died in a hail of bullets, but his true legacy was quieter, an echo that refuses to fade, a reminder that even when a king falls, the gravity he created never really lets go. Chapter 17. The Code of Silence. Silence. It was the thing that defined Frankie Yale's life, and the thing that gave it shape long after his death. In the Underworld, silence was currency, armor, and weapon, all at once. Those who spoke too much didn't last. Those who stayed quiet lived long enough to become legends. And among the dead, Yale's silence spoke louder than anyone's voice ever could. Even after his murder, the men who had known him refused to talk. The cops tried, reporters begged, rivals gossiped, but nobody told the whole story. Nobody broke the code. That was his true legacy. Not the money, not the power, not the blood. It was the silence that swallowed everything. In the years that followed his assassination, Brooklyn became a graveyard of whispers. Everyone knew who had ordered the hit, but no one dared to say it out loud. The papers printed rumors about Capone, but even the journalists chose their words carefully. They'd write Chicago connections or Midwestern associates, never daring to name him. The cops knew too, of course, but what could they do? The ones who had the evidence were either dead or suddenly uninterested in talking. One detective, years later, admitted quietly, "You could threaten those boys with prison, but it didn't matter. They feared breaking silence more than dying." That was Frankie's influence, echoing even through fear, an unspoken rule that kept everyone's mouth shut. The Code of Silence, omerta, the word the Italians brought with them from the old country, wasn't new. But Yale had turned it into an art form. He didn't just live by it. He used it. It was his philosophy, his strategy. He understood that noise brought weakness, that men who shouted about their power were already losing it. So he trained his soldiers not to talk, not to brag, not even to look like they had something to say. The less they revealed, the more invincible they became. It was the same way he ran his business. Every deal had layers. Every message had two meanings. Every threat came dressed in politeness. And every secret died with him. It's hard to imagine now, in a world built on headlines and exposure, how much power silence once carried. Yale never needed to announce what he controlled. The docks, the breweries, the clubs, they all ran because everyone understood who really held the keys. He didn't sign orders. He didn't write things down. His commands were air, softly spoken, passed hand to hand, fading the moment they were heard. That's how he survived so long. There was nothing to trace, nothing to prove, nothing to confess. In a world where every man eventually left a trail of noise, Frankie left only quiet. And that quiet outlasted him. After his death, his silence became myth. It was as if the city itself absorbed it, like a secret it refused to share. Reporters would visit his old haunts, hoping to dig up stories. They'd find bartenders who remembered his smile, priests who remembered his donations, cops who remembered his bribes, but none of them would tell the story straight. Each version contradicted the last. Was he kind or cruel, loyal or selfish, a peacemaker or a killer? The truth was slippery, and maybe that's exactly how he wanted it. You couldn't destroy what you couldn't define. The men who came after him borrowed his silence, but never understood it. They imitated the form, not the purpose. To Frankie, silence wasn't just about secrecy, it was about control. It was how he stayed calm in chaos, how he kept men loyal, how he made enemies doubt themselves. A man who doesn't react, who doesn't explain, who doesn't flinch, that kind of man terrifies people. It's the stillness before the storm that always feels most dangerous. That's what Yale embodied. That's why even his killers never spoke openly of what they'd done. There was superstition around it. as if to speak his name too boldly after his death would invite his ghost to listen. His ghost lingered in the quiet moments, a shadow behind a bar mirror, a reflection in a car window. You could almost feel it in the still air of Brooklyn's side streets at night, the weight of what wasn't said. To the older generation of mobsters, his name was caution. To the younger, it was a mystery. They couldn't comprehend how a man could wield so much power without ever raising his voice. They lived in a louder world now, a world of headlines and machine guns, of Capones and Castellanos, where fear was measured by how many bodies hit the floor. Yale had been something different, an instrument of order in a world addicted to chaos. The silence surrounding his death also created something else: doubt. People began to wonder if he had known it was coming. Theories spread that he had gone willingly, that he'd seen the trap and walked into it out of pride, or exhaustion, or a belief that death was just another kind of business. Some said he had arranged his own end, that the hit had been approved by him, in some final gesture of control. Others believed he'd left instructions, that his men had carried out a quiet retaliation afterward that no one ever traced. None of it could be proven. None of it ever would be. That was the beauty of silence. It made truth irrelevant. In one police report, written months after his death, an officer noted, "No one will talk. It's as though the man never existed." That line, meant as frustration, became poetry, because maybe that was Yale's last and greatest trick, not just to dominate his world while alive, but to erase himself from it when he was gone. He'd built his empire in shadows, and when the light finally touched it, it dissolved like smoke. Capone, for all his power, never achieved that kind of invisibility. He was fire, bright, destructive, impossible to ignore. Frankie was mist, there 1 second, gone the next, still shaping everything around him. Even after Capone fell, arrested and caged, Yale's influence remained, woven into the very fabric of how the Mafia thought. His methods became doctrine. His silence became law. The syndicate that emerged in the 1930s and 40s was built on his principles. Never speak, never write, never show weakness. The same silence that had once protected Yale, now protected an entire empire. But there's another layer to the code of silence, one that even the gangsters themselves rarely acknowledged. It wasn't just about hiding from the law. It was about emotion. Frankie understood that once you started explaining yourself, you lost control, not just of your secrets, but of your story. He never explained himself to anyone. Not his friends, not his family, not even to Al Capone when the distance between them grew cold. When Capone accused him, Frankie didn't defend himself. He didn't plead, didn't argue. He let the silence answer for him. And maybe, deep down, that was what sealed his fate. Because men like Capone feared silence. They needed words to control, to justify, to threaten. Frankie's refusal to speak was the one thing they couldn't match. There's an old saying in Naples: a silent man owns his enemy's thoughts. That was Yale to his core. He made men invent their own fears about him. They filled the gaps he left behind, each imagining something worse than the truth. It's how he controlled his city, and how he continued to control it even after death. The silence became an atmosphere, something you breathed without realizing it. In the 1940s, a journalist revisited his story for a crime magazine. He tracked down Yale's old acquaintances, his relatives, his rivals. The article ran under the headline "The Ghost of Brooklyn: Why No One Talks About Frankie Yale." It was full of contradictions, half-truths, and shadows, but it captured something real. He was the man who ruled by absence, the writer concluded. Even when he was in the room, you felt like he was somewhere else, listening. That line echoed through generations of mob lore. They began calling him the Quiet King, a title that fit better in death than it ever had in life. His silence infected the culture. Detectives investigating mob cases would invoke his name when witnesses refused to testify. Yale rules. They'd mutter in frustration, knowing exactly what it meant. The reporters covering organized crime began to romanticize it. The stoic, unbreakable gangster who faced death with a calm nod and a closed mouth. Hollywood loved it too. The mobsters on screen, with their controlled voices and poker faces, were all descendants of that silence. He had become the template for power without noise. And yet, not all silence is strength. There was a cost. For the families left behind, the wives, the children, the code meant they never got answers. Lucida Yale lived the rest of her life in the shadow of questions no one would answer. Who had betrayed him? Why had it happened? Who had ordered the bullets that shredded the man she once called husband? She asked those questions until her death, and every time, the men around her gave the same answer. Nothing. The same nothing Frankie had built his empire on. It protected him in life and punished those who loved him after death. That's the double edge of the code of silence. It preserves power but kills truth. It's a shield that becomes a coffin. Every man who lived by it eventually paid that price. They died misunderstood, half-remembered, their humanity buried under myth. And maybe that's how they preferred it. Frankie certainly would have. To be remembered as a legend was safer than to be remembered as a man. Men are mortal. Legends can't be killed. Years later, when a mafia turned into a corporate empire and the old neighborhoods disappeared, some said the silence died too. But it didn't. It just changed form. It became institutional. Businessmen learned it. Politicians mastered it. The art of saying nothing while meaning everything. Yale had perfected that before anyone else. His silence became part of the American playbook of power. The way executives spoke in riddles during scandals. The way leaders avoided confession. The way control was maintained not by shouting, but by withholding. The same silence that once ruled the Brooklyn docks now ruled boardrooms. The language of kings and criminals was, in the end, the same. In the small hours of the night, when Brooklyn sleeps and the wind rolls off the East River, the city still feels like it's holding its breath. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's the ghost of the man who taught everyone to keep their mouths shut. Some say if you walk past the spot where his car crashed, you can still hear the faint hum of an engine idling, as if waiting for the next order that will never come. Others say you can hear footsteps following you, steady, patient, never hurrying. Whether those stories are true doesn't matter. What matters is that they exist, that the silence itself became the storyteller. That was always Yale's genius. He didn't need words to explain who he was or what he'd done. His absence said it all. He knew that in a world built on betrayal, talking too much was the first step toward being forgotten. Silence, paradoxically, made him immortal. It turned him from a man into a myth, from a headline into an echo. And like all echoes, it repeats itself endlessly, reshaping every room it enters. Even now, a century later, every time someone in power chooses not to speak, when they hold back, when they let others fill the silence with their own interpretations, they're following the same unwritten law Frankie Yale lived and died by. The code of silence didn't die with him. It just changed faces. It slipped into politics, business, law enforcement, the everyday dance of those who control and those who obey. His silence became the rhythm of the world. And so the story ends where it began, in quiet. The city still hums with unseen deals. The old streets still whisper names no one dares to repeat. And somewhere, in the hush between truth and rumor, Frankie Yale still waits, unbothered, unbroken, listening to the noise of a world he once ruled simply by saying nothing at all. Chapter 18. The Legacy of Shadows. When a man like Frankie Yale dies, the world doesn't stop. The streets don't go silent forever. The liquor still flows, the money still changes hands, and the guns still find new reasons to speak. But something shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly. It's like a note missing from a familiar song. You might not notice at first, but once you do, the whole rhythm feels wrong. That was what Brooklyn felt like in the years after Frankie's death. The same streets, the same faces, the same deals, but the music had changed. The melody that once hummed beneath it all, calm, confident, composed, was gone. In its place came chaos pretending to be order, noise masquerading as power. Frankie's shadow had vanished from the sidewalks, but the shape it left behind defined everything that came after. The story of Frankie Yale didn't end in 1928. It simply fractured, spreading through the veins of every man who tried to follow in his footsteps. Some inherited his discipline, others his ambition, but none his balance. His world had been built on contradictions: the gentleman and the gangster, the undertaker and the executioner, the king who ruled by whisper. After him, those contradictions fell apart. Men chose sides. They became either monsters or martyrs. There were no more gentlemen left in the game. Brooklyn itself seemed to mourn him in its own way. The docks he'd once controlled grew quieter, swallowed by industry and time. The old speakeasies turned into restaurants and shops. The walls that had once echoed with deals made in low voices now hummed with the chatter of ordinary lives. But the bones of the past were still there, buried under the asphalt. The men who came after still used his routes, his rules, his rhythm. They just didn't use his restraint. Frankie had believed in control, in precision, in the idea that power should never look desperate. The men who replaced him believed in display. They wore their wealth like armor, their violence like theater. They missed the point entirely. Even Al Capone, the student who had once called him boss, carried Yale's ghost with him until the end. In his final years, as the disease hollowed him out and left him talking to shadows, witnesses said he'd mutter about Brooklyn, about loyalty, about silence. Some swore they heard him call out Frankie's name late at night, his voice breaking like a confession. "Frankie," he'd whisper, "I didn't mean it that way." Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was both. But in that delirium, the truth was clear. The man who had destroyed his teacher could never escape what his teacher had built. Capone's empire outlived Yale's, but not his principles. Frankie's fingerprints were still there, in the discipline, in the structure, in the illusion of sophistication that made organized crime look almost noble. Capone had borrowed his mentor's soul, but never understood how to carry it. The next generation of mobsters did. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. They took the fragments of Yale's philosophy and rebuilt them into the modern Mafia. They gave it shape, hierarchy, and strategy, but the foundation was still his. They learned from his mistakes as much as his successes. Luciano once said, "The old guys like Yale, they had style. We just added business." It was half true. What they added in efficiency, they lost in grace. Yale had been the bridge between two worlds, the street and the boardroom, the old codes and the new systems. Without him, the transition would have been chaos. He made crime intelligent before it became corporate. That's why even decades later, when historians write about the birth of organized crime in America, Frankie's name sits quietly at the beginning of every line, not shouted, not celebrated, but undeniably there, like the bass note in a symphony no one can play without. But not everyone remembered him as a legend. To the people of Brooklyn, the dock workers, the street vendors, the families who had once lived under his invisible protection, he was still just a man. They remembered the small acts of control, the strange fairness he sometimes showed. The local baker who said Yale once paid double for a wedding cake just to help a struggling shop. The priest who swore he saw him slip envelopes into collection baskets anonymously. The mothers who told their sons not to speak his name, but who still lit candles for him in secret. To them, he wasn't a monster or a saint. He was the cost of their safety, the man who made sure the chaos of the city never crossed their doorsteps. They missed that kind of control when it was gone. The new gangsters didn't care about neighborhoods. They cared about markets. Frankie's Brooklyn had belonged to him. Their Brooklyn belonged to everyone and no one. Over time, his story became less about fact and more about feeling. Old-timers told it like folklore, with the kind of reverence reserved for kings and devils. They said he never raised his voice, that he could settle a war with a single look. They said his office smelled like lilies and cigar smoke, that he once attended a rival's funeral and tipped the undertaker for his work. They said he died smiling. None of it could be proven, but it didn't matter. The myth was cleaner than the truth. The myth made sense. It gave people something to hold on to. Because the truth, that power can be quiet, that evil can wear a silk tie, that a man can kill and still carry dignity. That truth was harder to accept. Even the police couldn't escape his legend. Some of them admired him in private, though they'd never admit it. The detectives who had chased him for years found themselves studying his old methods long after he was gone. One retired cop later confessed, "He made us better, smarter. We had to be. He didn't make mistakes, so we couldn't afford to either." That was Yale's influence. He improved even his enemies. He forced the law to evolve just to keep up. The idea of surveillance, of tracking patterns instead of people, of treating organized crime like a business, that all started with men like him. He made the police professional by making crime professional first. But for his family, the legacy was quieter, lonelier. His wife and daughters lived the rest of their lives in the long shadow of his name. They never spoke of him publicly. They changed addresses, changed circles, tried to outlive the whispers. The money ran out faster than anyone expected. The friends who'd once sworn loyalty vanished into new alliances. The newspapers lost interest. History moved on. For the world, Frankie Yale became a myth. For his family, he was just an absence that never stopped echoing. That's the cruelest part of power. It doesn't just corrupt the man who holds it. It consumes everything that tries to love him. And yet, the shadow he left wasn't all darkness. For decades after his death, young gangsters still studied his story, not as a warning, but as a model. They saw how he combined ruthlessness with restraint, how he dressed like a banker but thought like a general, how he controlled everything without ever seeming to hold on too tight. They called him the blueprint. He was proof that crime could be civilized, that success didn't always require noise or spectacle. And in a twisted way, he became an example not just for criminals, but for America itself. Businessmen, politicians, and executives adopted his principles without ever knowing his name. Control perception, hide your intentions, speak less, move fast, never explain. Frankie's underworld philosophy became the language of the legitimate world. That was his greatest trick. He blurred the line so completely that no one ever found it again. As the decades rolled on, his story faded into the background of time, but every now and then, someone would stumble upon his name. A historian, a journalist, a filmmaker, and the fascination would ignite all over again. They'd describe him as the gentleman of gangland, the silent architect, the first modern mobster. But those titles missed the point. Frankie never wanted to be remembered. He wanted control, not credit. Fame was noise, and noise was weakness. His true victory was invisibility. He built a legacy so quiet that it never died because it never stood still long enough to be killed. Somewhere in Brooklyn, beneath the hum of modern life, his city still carries pieces of him. The rhythm of its streets, the hierarchy of its neighborhoods, the unwritten rules about respect. All of it still bears his fingerprints. You can see it in the way men lower their voices before talking business, in the way old-timers still measure power by composure, not volume. You can feel it in the unspoken codes that govern loyalty, honor, and vengeance. They may not know his name anymore, but they're still playing by his rules. The world changed, but the shadows never did. If you walk past St. John's Cemetery today, where Yale lies beneath the soil of Queens, you'll find his grave surprisingly modest. Just a name, a date, and a silence that feels heavier than marble. The flowers are often fresh, though no one ever sees who leaves them. Sometimes it's roses, sometimes white lilies, the same kind he once kept in his funeral home. Maybe it's family, maybe it's strangers, maybe it's the city itself, still paying its respects to a man it can't quite forget. The wind moves softly there, carrying the distant sound of traffic, the hum of a world he helped shape but could never own. There's a strange kind of poetry in how his story ends, not with redemption, not with justice, but with equilibrium. The man who brought calm to chaos became part of the city's quiet. His silence outlasted the bullets, the noise, the wars, even the men who thought they'd replaced him. That's the secret of legacy. It doesn't belong to the loud or the violent. It belongs to those who shape the world without needing to shout about it. Frankie Yale didn't need history to remember his name. He made sure history couldn't forget his influence. As night falls over Brooklyn, the lights of the modern world flicker against the old stone and brick, blending past and present until they look the same. The city is louder now, faster, colder. But every once in a while, when the streets grow quiet and the fog rolls in from the river, it feels like time pauses, like the city itself remembers how it used to breathe under Frankie's rule. In that stillness, if you listen close enough, you can almost hear the rhythm that once held it all together. The echo of polished shoes on wet pavement, the low hum of an idling engine, the faint sound of a man's voice saying nothing at all, and meaning everything. Because that was Frankie Yale's true legacy. Not the wealth, not the empire, not even the betrayal that ended him. His legacy was the silence that still hums beneath the noise of power. The understanding that control isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who never has to. He taught a generation that real strength doesn't announce itself. It radiates quietly, like gravity. And though his life ended in a hail of bullets, his presence never really disappeared. It dissolved into the fabric of every deal, every handshake, every unspoken agreement that has ever shaped this city. So when you think of the gangsters who came after him, the Capones, the Lucianos, the Gambinos, remember that they were just echoes. Frankie Yale was the first sound, the low, steady note that still vibrates beneath the surface of history. The sound of discipline, of calculation, of control. The sound of a man who ruled with silence, and still does. He began as a poor boy from Long Island City, raised by Neapolitan immigrants who knew more about survival than success. He died as a legend, his name whispered in reverence and fear across two coasts. But somewhere between those 2 points, he built something larger than an empire. He built an idea that even in a world of blood and betrayal, there could be elegance. That chaos could wear a tailored suit. That the darkest corners of America could still produce men who understood balance. And that idea, long after the man himself turned to dust, still stands. It stands in the way people chase power today. It stands in the quiet confidence of those who control from the shadows. It stands in the truth that will outlive us all. That silence, when mastered, is the loudest sound in the world. And so, as the credits of history roll past his name, and the city moves on, one thing remains. The shadow he casts still stretches across time, long, patient, and unbroken. The man is gone, but the silence he built still speaks. Frankie Yale's empire of whispers still rules the dark corners of memory, a reminder that true power doesn't vanish when the man does. It just changes form. It hides. It waits. It listens. And then, when the world gets too loud, it returns, softly, invisibly, like a ghost in a well-tailored suit, standing in the quiet, watching, as the city he once ruled keeps moving to his rhythm.